I hereby call this meeting, January 14th of the City Council to order. This will be a discussion-only meeting. The first item of business is the roll call. Could the clerk call the roll, please?
Councilmember Babcock?
Present.
Councilmember Gregg?
Here.
Councilmember Meadows?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Stevens?
Here.
Mayor Byer?
Here. The second order of business is approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Moved by Councilmember Meadows, seconded by Councilmember Babcock. Any additions or changes? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We have an agenda. The next item is the communications from the audience. We do this every meeting. If anybody would like to speak, please come forward after the first speaker and fill out a blue card. The first speaker is Miss Hollenbach? Eleanor Hollenberg. Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mayor Byer and Council. I'm Eleanor Holbrook, and I live at 812 Lantern Hill Drive. And I've been here before a number of times talking about the deer. So your item number 4.5. I'm really happy that you're discussing this now. I know it's been a long process and community meetings and consulting with experts and deer surveys and the deer cam in my backyard and that sort of thing. So you really have a lot of knowledge about going into this and looking at the ballot question. I just have some questions about it. And I know this is discussion only, so this is appropriate. I'm wondering why council had not taken a position, but is thinking about the ballot question in particular. And wondering whether Ann Arbor or Meridian Township took this to a ballot proposal. I hadn't heard of that before, and I thought, well, this is something that I thought council was going to take a position at some point and have a policy on health and safety and the other kinds of ramifications of having a large deer population in the city. And I'm wondering also if this should go to ballot proposal, and is on the ballot in August, and we have another summer of deer with all the attendant problems, and it doesn't pass, does this tie your hands going forward in terms of using the particular mechanism that's mentioned in the proposed ballot question? So these are, I know you're going to talk about this, and I know it's a serious question. But in the meantime, the deer population is certainly still growing, and it's grown a lot in the last 5 years since you've been talking about it. So it is appropriate for you to really be thinking and going forward with this. So thank you very much for your attention to it.
Thank you. And we'll make sure we address those two questions during the discussion, unless somebody wants to speak to her now during the discussion, okay?
I think we're going to get that information from
Okay. Is that good?
our attorney.
All right. You're on.
Thank you. My name is Brian Jackson. I work for the newly formed Ingham County Public Defender's Office, and I'm here to speak on agenda item number 1, plea bargains. And basically, I'm going to speak to oppose or actually support the reduction of fines and costs. I'm going to speak opposing fines and costs generally, because I think ultimately there's a strong argument that poverty is criminalized. And I say that in the sense that some people who are assessed fines and costs that can't afford to pay can and do face criminal sanctions, such as possibly jail at the worst, extended probation, even more fines. So there's that on there, but specifically I'd like to talk about the fines and costs as it relates to driving offenses, because I can see the difference between certain criminal actions, whether it's assault or theft, versus driving offenses, which under the law is a crime. However, the people I represent would probably argue otherwise. So I represent people who don't have a lot of money in cases in East Lansing. I'm the public defender that's assigned to this courtroom, so I handle both misdemeanor dockets, both judges, and I see a lot of driving while license suspended cases. Tomorrow morning, 4 out of 5 of my pretrials are for driving while license suspended. And thankfully for those people, as I'll try to explain a little later, those people are coming on Wednesday, which means they were charged by the Ingham County prosecutor that doesn't deal with East Lansing. That means they were pulled over by a Michigan State police officer, Michigan State University, or possibly a state trooper south of Grand River, because anything north would be the city of East Lansing. So I only say fortunate for them just because jurisdictions handle them differently. For the Ingham County Prosecutor's Office, I'll explain, but for the most part, it's a lot more lenient as far as what happens. In Lansing, I've practiced there, it's a lot more lenient. Other places like Eaton County can be a little tougher sometimes. I haven't been out there in a while, but it's different per jurisdiction. It's just how it wants to be handled. So the people I represent, I'm sure a lot of them would love to be here right now, but they have a lot of life things. I invited a few people, but they are people. They have families, they have jobs, they have real life things going on, and they're charged with the misdemeanor punishable up to 1 year or $500, driving while license suspended. A few examples of some of the types of people I see. One is the person who was driving for whatever reason, got pulled over, did not know their license was suspended, and it's because they failed to pay a ticket in the past. Maybe they were speeding in Eaton County and they had their tail light out. That could be 2 tickets. They don't pay it, they eventually get suspended. Sometimes they don't know, sometimes they think it was all good, but they get suspended. So therefore, if they're caught driving again, which happens a lot, they'll be charged with driving while license suspended. Now, normally, this person can then go, if they have the money, to this jurisdiction, Eaton County, for example, and pay the speeding ticket and the tail light out ticket, and then get a clearance paper, and then take that to Secretary of State and get their license reinstated. So a lot of times, if they can afford it and they are aware of where this place is and because sometimes they don't know, but when they find out and they can afford it, a lot of times they try to go clear it, which means they paid maybe $250 plus $250 to equal $500 to get a full clearance. So they paid $500, saved for it, did whatever they had to do. They come back and then have to deal with this case for driving while it was suspended, even though their license is now reinstated. It's different on what happens, but a lot of times here, it's, from my understanding, policy that's been in place for some time, they will reduce the charge to a civil infraction, which means it does not affect your license. You can still keep your valid license, and fortunately, the civil infraction they choose also carries 0 points for their insurance. So that's a good deal, except as a policy stands, you have to pay $500 to get that deal. And I have to tell a lot of people who really want their license, and as you can all imagine, a lot of people do, especially here in Michigan. I have to tell them, well, you have to pay $500 because you do. So they tell me their situation. For example, another situation could be the guy who's caught driving to work because he needs a job, but also because he has his license suspended because he owes child support. And if you owe child support, your license gets suspended. So he gets arrested, goes to jail, wherever that child support is. The judge says, all right, you need to get a job and you need to do this or else. So this person maybe doesn't have access to Uber or an easy line, and they have to get to work. So this person gets pulled over and is charged with driving while license suspended because your license was not valid. So in this case, and to the prosecutors and the city attorney's credit, there are times where I can explain a situation like, this person is basically homeless. And they'll consider that and then maybe reduce it to sometimes okay, I don't want to use homeless, but maybe just different things where it's bad because where their finances are insecure. I could get it reduced maybe to like $400 or something in that consideration, which is great, except it's still a lot. So there's that person. And also, the most recent child support person I had, we did work out a great deal where this person could pay the $400 it would be to Eaton County child support within 4 months and then show us that, and it gets dismissed. And that's a great resolution. But if they didn't, then it's just on. So that child support person got a great deal, in my opinion. But the ones I had before that, they were fighting against the policy, basically, the plea bargain policy. So another person who drives often is a person who doesn't usually drive. But I had to take my wife to her diabetes appointment or something like that. And they did it, and they took the risk, and they got caught, and they're charged with driving while license suspended. And they come to court. If they can go clear their license and bring it back, then they can get the civil infraction. But these people can't do it because they're on fixed incomes. So they don't get the benefit of the civil infraction. Instead, they would plead guilty to a reduced charge of a misdemeanor charge of no license on person. It's not so bad, no one's gonna go to jail, but basically you're gonna be assessed $500 because that's part of the agreement per the policy, but you don't have to pay it within 2 months. Instead, you can get on a payment plan because it's the misdemeanor. So the civil infractions have to be paid within 60 days, but the misdemeanors, which no one really wants, you get to get on a payment plan for that. So the misdemeanors aren't the worst thing ever. This no license on person, what it does is it just prevents you from getting your license within 30 days and is a misdemeanor. I worry about it for some of my younger people who might have another thing in the future and they worry about expungement in the future, where you can only have three or less misdemeanors and so on. I just worry about those counting against them and other little things. And then there's the worst offender when it comes to the policy. This person is the person who was charged and convicted of 2 drunk drivings in the past, a long time ago for the most part. Sometimes, let's say, the last one happened 12 years ago. And this person is not eligible to get their license until a certain period in time where they show their sobriety, get all these letters of recommendation, do all these different things, and also don't get any driving while license suspended or driving offenses. What happens with them is they make it so long, and then they get a prior or some other no license on person, they get caught driving, and then their time gets pushed back. I have people who will be in the process of, oh, that my time finally came, it's 2020. I've been waiting so long. I got all my stuff in order. I'm going to schedule one of those appointments where you got to go through the administrative hearing with Secretary of State, and hopefully it all works out. But I got this driving while license suspended. Those people will get no offer, plea bargain offer, because they have had 2 prior drunk driving offenses, and they're considered the worst because of the priors. And I understand that. But so $500 is a lot of money to the people I represent. And most people, I really don't know if most people actually pay it off. There's probably some stats on that, but I know it's really hard. And they're all worried about it. And some of them don't. And when those people don't pay it off in time, their case comes back to this court and is dealt with like it just started. Sometimes, depending on how much money they have readily available, they can get back on it, or sometimes it'll be extended for a month or 2 or so, but sometimes not so much. I always wondered, why are we charging people the price we do and all these things? And it's always tough to explain to my people, my clients. I ultimately say East Lansing wants their money. That's all I can really say, because they also have had prior, sometimes, driving while license suspended. People that don't have their license and also can't get their license, they still drive, and they get caught. and they have prior driving license, so they know the routine. They go to jail that day, their car gets impounded, so that's $200 to get out. They go to jail, who cares about what they're doing? Sometimes they're gonna lose their job because they just got a new job, but now they go to jail, whatever. Family, no one wants to go to jail, no matter how much money you have. And by the way, if you do a day in jail, that is a $25 credit to your fines and costs, court approved, and I believe policy approved. So I guess I would just ask that the court consider lowering the amount and changing the policy as it comes to driving offenses, and kind of follow maybe what the prosecutor does for the most part, which is if you are driving while license suspended, you pay your 2 tickets or do whatever it takes to get your license, and you come back and you either have your license or the clearances, which are the 2 tickets, the speeding and the defective equipment, are then paid off, the prosecutor says, good, you got your license. Good for you. That's what we wanted. You can drive. I'm going to dismiss this. I see that you just paid $600 to do this, and I'm glad you took care of it. Thank you. That's the people who clear the license. For the people who can't clear the license, lower the fine from $500 just because it's burdensome, especially to the poor people. And I would recommend $100 if you had to do a fine, which you probably do. $100 is enough. The prosecutor or the city attorney also has a legal right to charge restitution for going to jail, and they do every time as part of the plea deal, $60 if you go to jail. If you're there for just an hour, they may waive the $60, but most people aren't because they can't get out right away. They also charge the cost of prosecution. I'm not sure if that, I don't think that is part of the driving ones all the time, but it's definitely for other ones. So there's still other fines out there. Lansing, Ingham County, if you have a no license on defective equipment, for example, when you get the civil infraction, instead of $500, it's $125. I was assistant city attorney there. That's what it was a few years ago. If you have to plead guilty and go in front of the judge for driving while license suspended, because that's the only time you have to, along with other offenses like ODBs, all those things. But for the driving offenses, the judge will have the discretion to decide what to do, and often they hear what's going on and they lower the fines and costs. But $500 is the maximum allowed for driving while license suspended and no license on person. And the people always are supposed to, based on the policy, they're supposed to, unless things change, pay the $500. Thank you.
Can you hang on one second? Councilmember Meadows?
I've got a couple of questions and a couple of comments on this. You know, what you're describing is really something that the legislature tried to eliminate when they eliminated the driver responsibility fees, which was really causing exactly what you're describing here, which is the incredible number of people in the state who were driving with a suspended license because they were unable to pay $2,000, $3,000 worth of accumulated fines that were assessed against them under the driver responsibility fee law. I'm willing to take a look at all of this. I think that, you know, the way that elimination of that fee operated, you know, we looked at about $150 to eliminate the driver responsibility fees, and if that isn't what we're doing by even plea bargaining to a civil infraction, then I'd like to see us, you know, lower these fees substantially so that we can keep people lawfully on the road and not put artificial barriers up to keep them, I guess, in the legal system, you know, going forward. Is there a policy at the county or at the city of Lansing, which you should know about, I know, that specifically talks about looking at the indigency of the individual and determining what the appropriate plea bargain and the appropriate fee would be?
I'm not aware of a policy, And I know an argument against things is we got to treat our people the same. If you were driving while license suspended, you're driving while license suspended. But at the same time, a lot of people don't have paid the over $1,000 for attorney and then also have dad right there ready. As far as how Lansing and Ingham has handled it, it's pretty much the assistant prosecutor on the spot has a discretion. They already know what's good and what's bad. There's no high priority to prosecute or collect from this, and they are all happy once someone gets their license back, for sure. And they don't really care as much if not. There are policies against the multiple OWIs, DUI charges.
Right.
But other than that, it's pretty discretionary. A lot of assistant prosecutors will look at how many prior times you got caught, and then weigh that differently. But I would still argue, no matter how many times you got caught, if that's what you're doing is driving while license suspended, and it's financial, which would be anything besides these OWIs for the most part, or medical, can't see or something like that, then the goal should be the same, and it should still not be so tough.
Well, I'll just, if I can just continue,
Yep.
I'm sensitive to what you're saying here, and I'd like to see us take a look at the idea of looking at moving it to a civil infraction as soon as we possibly can, after we've analyzed what the charges are and what the background of the individual is. But also, $500 seems pretty steep to me in terms of this. And if we're going to move it to a civil infraction, it seems to me we ought to look at it as a driving without a license, not necessarily driving on a suspended license. And that fine is about $150. I'll just note that when the driver responsibility fees were changed, the legislature moved all of the subsequent fees that they established in those bills into the fire protection fund. That's the only source of revenue that comes to the city for fire protection as well. It comes from that fund that was created, and there's no other money that goes in there other than these fees that were established when they eliminated the driver responsibility fees. So to the extent that the prosecutor is prosecuting them, some of that money actually comes back to the city at some point. So I think we're giving up a lot when we do plea bargain these out, but I think we should have a more liberal plea bargaining policy on this. So
Hang on
thanks
one
for
second.
coming and talking about this.
Mayor Pro Tem Stevens?
So, what's the period in which someone has time to get their license back, typically?
It really depends on what they're suspended for and their ability to take care of it. People usually start from not knowing that they're suspended, and the prudent people will go to Secretary of State and try to find out. And I tell them to, and sometimes they do. But some people know, some people don't know. Can you pay off your 2 or 3 tickets? Can you pay the one off in Detroit and the one off in Eaton County and the one off in Clinton County?
Right.
And then, bring all those together. Some people can't do it, some people can. So really in 30 days, the person, that's usually the amount of time given for an adjournment. Usually that's how long people are given to try and then come back and see what they've done. Half the time they've done something, the other half not enough.
And then, how many cases would you say in East Lansing you deal with this? Is this like a good amount of your caseload, or is this something that just happens
absolutely.
occasionally?
I mean, for me, just because my assignments are misdemeanors and we're here in, East Lansing, and the police, I think they run a lot of plates and they look for driving while license suspended. It's probably half of my caseload almost, and that's many.
Maybe we get better figure for it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would anybody else like to speak? Just, you can start and you can speak and then fill out the card when you're finished.
thank you
Great,
so
thanks.
much.
Yep.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Nick Pydek. I'm one of the co-owners of Foster Coffee, new to downtown East Lansing. And I just wanted to speak tonight on the parking issue, or namely what you guys are discussing in terms of extending the 5-minute grace period to 15. I think, I'm not entirely sure on the original intention of the 5 minutes, if you use the word grace to, if somebody pulls into a garage and then changes their mind. But so being in 3 different communities, we're in downtown Flint, we're in downtown Owasso, and now here in East Lansing, we see a lot of different parking situations. Owasso has 100% free parking. We're a town of about 15,000 people. And Flint, the DDA just actually issued new parking enforcement where they put cameras everywhere. So now they just ticket you through your license plate and mail you a bill. And they have a 5-minute grace period. And it's actually something we're advocating with their DDA to extend as well. As this relates to service industry like ours with coffee or any of these food service establishments that have, mobile pickup, or, if they're not getting Uber Eats or any of these services, DoorDash, that are delivering to our customers, but where customers are actually wanting to come into the establishment to order, this is a huge, huge win for us. We're in the Center City project. We have parking right above us. We're still addressing issues internally as a company to even raise awareness that this parking lot is here. We get this question a lot, like, where do we park? And you can actually park directly above us. It would also be great, tip to our hat to be like, oh, and also you can park there for free for 15 minutes. So, these are things that we think about as a business, is how do we reduce the barriers to entry? And for us, it means we've got to enact, some marketing initiatives, even filming things to show people, like, I'm standing in front of Foster, I literally park, and in less steps than it takes to park in the middle of a Meijer parking lot and get a gallon of milk, you can come in with less time and get a cup of coffee and be on your way. And I think this is also a huge win for people who actively live in the community, but may or may not shop downtown due to, obviously, speaking as one of the contributors to this in an indirect way, the construction being a barrier to entry. But once the construction changes in our particular block between Abbott and Mac, what happens to advocate for customers to come back to that area? And so I just had a few questions. One, I'm sharing an anecdotal story, but hopefully to throw some fuel into the discussion as well. To even ask is, for the parking task force, which I know is a newer group, to do a survey and ask how many of the service or retail industries like Foster, I would not want to stand here and just say and advocate that this is something that benefits just our business, but to view it as how many other businesses are like ours. I don't know if there's any other business owners here. I'm sure all of them would probably would advocate for this, anything that would reduce a barrier for somebody to come and spend money in their shop. So to ask how many service or quick service restaurants downtown would be affected, and if those changes would be positive or negative, to ask them, is this something that you would like? Is this something that you would dislike? I think you would probably get a lot of likes. And then, has there been any public perception study? This is me asking more as a new person to this community. Has there been a public perception study or survey that identifies the key barriers to shopping downtown? And are any of those barriers related to parking? Obviously, I mentioned one, construction being there, more anecdotally, but what's the data telling you? What's the data telling us? And then specifically regarding the 70,000 impact to the parking budget with this potential change, I would also encourage council to look at this as it may be a reduction in revenue by 70,000, but what's the gain in terms of additional tax capture or additional activation of citizens or business that would otherwise leave? I don't know if you capture that back through property assessments, specifically Personal property exemptions are not allowed for retail and service industries, if I understand your laws correctly. So if they're the ones that are net gaining, you're also getting that back in other ways. I also know this too as a personal story entering the community. You know, we have 18 employees in downtown, and one of the first things we had to talk with everybody is like, where do I park? How do I get passes? So I imagine of being a business that employs 18 people, we're also funding the parking revenue in another way by helping equip our employees to park. And we do that through travel reimbursements and actually bumping up their paychecks so they can afford parking, because we see that as an issue for hiring and retaining. So just a couple things for food for thought. And one last thing, I think, again, this could be part of your study is, you know, if turnover rate is a significant issue that you're having in the parking garages in terms of people are parking and staying there and there's not room for space, I think having something where you're matriculating people in on a 15-minute basis would allow some of these lots that are at max capacity, which I know we researched several of the garages and a lot of them were sold out when we first opened. So it may encourage that turnover rate, which again would cause people to come in, spend money, and then leave and allow new people to come in. So thank you.
Could you hang on one second?
Yeah.
Councilmember Craig?
I'm the liaison to the parking task force, and I'm also a downtown
Awesome.
business owner, so I'm just personally inviting you to come and chat with me about parking.
Awesome.
'Cause
Thank you.
it's super fun to chat about.
Yeah, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Stevens?
So, and I'm looking at Caleb in the back over there. We did just have our first meeting of the parking task force. Myself and Councilmember Greg in attendance, and we're kind of splitting it off into 3 different avenues: marketing, future planning, as well as the finances of it. So while we're going to have this discussion tonight, there are going to be further discussions. So I don't think we had a meeting, and I'm looking at Caleb for verification. I don't think we had a meeting date set for the next one yet, just because we did split off and we're trying to work out scheduling. But I would be encouraging, I'll reach out to you at some point. I have your contact info for the next meeting.
I would be happy to.
Public meetings.
Yeah,
So.
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would anybody else like to address council?
Hi, this is my first time, so bear with me here. I'm Brian Moody. I'm here to discuss discussion item 6, the discussion of the Oakwood Historic District boundary. Again, I'm Brian Moody. I'm here today with a few of my housemates at the co-op. I'm the Vice President of Facilities for the MSU Student Housing Cooperative, as well as a full-time resident of the Oakwood neighborhood, living in the Phoenix Co-op at 239 Oak Hill for 3 years now. So as both a resident impacted by this decision and a representative of the SHC whose job is impacted by the historic district, I come today to advocate for the redrawing of the historic boundary to exclude the properties on the perimeter of Valley Court Park. I've often heard the argument that the historic district is there as an assurance that the co-op upkeeps 239 Oak Hill. Rather than fostering improvement, the historic district proves to be a barrier and a hoop to jump through when trying to improve our properties on a limited budget. This leaves little room for us to do major repairs. Removal from the historic district opens up new avenues for our property. As it stands, Phoenix will need major renovations over the coming years. Removal means that we are able to spend significantly less money on certain repairs, mostly anything that faces the street, and also speeds up the process as we no longer have to subject ourselves to lengthy appropriateness applications. We would also work closely with the neighborhood to build something that accurately reflects the community that we are surrounded by, should we ever decide to do so. The historic district should be used as a tool to maintain the feel of a colonial revival neighborhood, not as a weapon to protect from blight and development. The overwhelming majority of properties from Hillcrest to Abbott along Oak Hill are licensed rental properties. If the true intention was to maintain the feel of a historic neighborhood, certain measures would have been made to include all of these current rental properties in the overlay district when it was formed to prevent turnover and constant wear due to multifamily and student renting. The idea that old buildings make a neighborhood historic ignores a majority of what it means to meet the criteria of being historic. Most of these houses, including 239 Oak Hill, no longer retain the same style from when they were originally built. 239 is now green, with a block extension housing 29 people. This property's recent history, stretching back to the times of being a fraternity before the boundary was drawn, does not reflect the criteria of what it means to be historic. Most of the homes encased by the aforementioned area between Hillcrest and Evergreen also fail to meet the feeling criteria of what it takes to make something historic, as they all have been converted to multifamily rental properties. Again, making the historic district an inappropriate measure to take against the properties around the park to preserve historical appropriateness. The point being, yes, our buildings are old, but they no longer reflect what it means to be historic, as the changes in material, appearance, and surroundings have all resulted in a completely different property. Therefore, it should be represented as such. All of the properties surrounding the park have faced an influx of rental properties and development. Given that our situation has significantly changed from the environment of the neighborhood in decades prior, this should be reflected appropriately in removal from the boundaries of the historic district. Thank you.
Hang on a second.
Brian.
Mayor Pro Tem Stevens?
Thanks for coming out. So what kind of improvements are you guys looking at doing that would?
We have nothing in
Historic
mind
district.
for right now, but for example, we have a window on the front of our house right now that's currently broken. The windows that are required to meet historical appropriateness and the process that we'd have to go through to replace a window of such type are lengthy and very much costly. Whereas, you know, in a situation where we're not in a historic district boundary, we would be able to run down to Home Depot, buy a $150, vinyl double hung window, and that's that. And instead of having a piece of OSB in front of the window for months at a time, waiting for a contractor or ourselves to go through the steps to replace those kinds of things.
So you guys actually don't have the window replaced, so what is?
Not right now, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's on the front or the side?
It's on the front of the house. So there are things like that where, because we work with a very limited budget, given that we have 17 houses. So by the time everything's all split apart, we're really not working with too much money per individual house. Some houses have more needs than others. So it's just overall, if we want to make any sort of improvements or renovations to our house, we really have to do sort of a cost-benefit analysis, and it gets expensive. So less things that we want done to the internal of our house are they're put on the back burner because we have to spend larger amount of money to do some of these things to the outside of our house.
Sure. So I'm going to take a page out of the mayor's book. And I don't believe we have our liaison to the historic district here today, but we do have a member of our building and planning staff, David Haywood. If you could raise your hand right there. And I highly suggest you guys connecting, try and figure out how we can get that window issue addressed, regardless of our conversation today on historic district, because obviously we're not taking a vote today. But we're going to be discussing kind of how we want to move forward. But that window issue is kind of a separate thing.
Yeah,
right
that
now.
was just an example.
No, I
yeah.
understand that, but it is an issue if you guys need to replace the window and
of course.
you feel like you can't. So hopefully you can connect with David, and then maybe if we could get an update at some point to see what was resolved, or if there was a amicable solution to it, it'd be great.
Anything else? I just have one question. Would your organization consider condemning or getting rid of the houses that need the most work and just selling that property?
We have no plans to condemn, if that's what you're asking. That's not a conversation we've ever had.
Okay, so have you ever done that with any of the co-ops?
I don't believe so. No.
that
That's kind of counterintuitive to our mission,
Right.
to expand the lower income housing opportunities to East Lansing. So
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Thank
one more quick
One
comment.
more?
So back a while ago, I had a conversation with Sam Burnt, who used to be at your organization, about solar technology. I know there was definitely an issue in historic districts at the time. So we recently, this is not related to necessarily this, but we recently passed an ordinance that addressed solar technology within historic districts, I think, in a really cool way. So if you guys are still looking into that.
Yep. We've already, well, not for 239 Oak Hill pertaining to Oakwood, but we are installing some solar technology.
And I know that
at
you
one of
guys
our
are
houses.
regularly looking at it,
Yeah.
so I just point you to that ordinance because I know that that's something the housing co-op is always looking at, and that was a way to kind of assist with that process in historic districts as well.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you mind just taking that with you?
Yes, sir.
And thank you. No problem.
Hi, I'm Sante Pirelli, resident of 227 Oak Hill Avenue, and I also want to address the Oakwood Boundary Commission study and proposals for changes in the boundary. Before I do so, I wanted to draw some public attention to the loss of a great local resident, Bart Wajenke, who was the principal at Hazlitt High School, and many of us know him. He was a great contributor to the community and a good friend, and I just wanted to mention his name. I generally support many of the comments that were made by the representative from the co-op. I've lived on Oak Hill Avenue since the early 1980s, over 37 years, and I've seen, perhaps more than most because of where I live, the day-to-day changes that have gone on that have affected the character and integrity of that particular part of the district. There have been efforts, particularly with the overlay district, to abate the conversion of single-family homes into rental properties. And that, in fact, has occurred in the northern part of the district. However, Oak Hill, as has been noted, was not included in that overlay. So we have a substantial change from what were many single-family owner-occupied homes on Oak Hill that define the character of that neighborhood to where it exists today. In addition, and maybe more specifically, the south side of Oak Hill sits on the perimeter of the park, and what has gone on the perimeter of the park itself has been substantial. As we know, how many meetings, how many committee meetings, how many commissions, how many studies have gone on to discern next steps with respect to what happens on the perimeter of Valley Court Park. Properties that are situated on the park are directly and have been directly impacted by those changes and those ongoing changes. We've seen there's more trespasses, crime, there's traffic, there's noise. The light pollution from the towers now are substantially changing the impact of properties on the perimeter of the park, including my own. When I look out my dining room right now, I see things that I never saw before. I hear things that I never heard before. And that change has really been substantial. It's been substantial without the development because of the conversion of many single-family homes into rental properties. But now, in addition to that, for properties that are situated on the park, there has been a substantial change in the character of those properties. And so I think that impacts the integrity of considering those properties as historic. I also wanted to emphasize that the proposed form-based zoning aspect of being considered by council in the future sets a new boundary in effect with respect to zoning on Oak Hill. So some of the concerns that have been expressed about changing the boundary of the historic district, there's almost a natural alignment that could occur here if, in fact, the council were to adopt the form-based zoning changes, which essentially draw a line down Oak Hill Avenue, separating the north and the south on Oak Hill for that purpose. So concerns about protecting properties to the north, and I might say, as an aside, I'm a little bit offended by some of the comments sometimes that are made about the properties on Oak Hill somehow being a berm for other properties north of them. It's my home. People live on Oak Hill. It's not a berm. It was never created as a berm. In fact, I've done my best to try and maintain that property and paid over $150,000 of taxes to the city over 37 years in order to maintain my property. There are other tools that may be available to the council in order to address some of the concerns by those who are in the district to the north. And I would encourage the council to think about less rigorous ways. You heard the co-op's experience in trying to address some of the problems that they have. Others in the district may have similar problems. It's really kind of a misnomer in some respect to have a historic district with a fairly aggressive process that has to be followed in order to meet historic district or ordinance requirements in an area that is low and moderate income housing residents and expecting people who may be senior citizens or others to come up with the money in order to meet those standards. I think that there's a separate consideration that might be given to that in terms of the existing ordinance and how that might be tweaked in order to address some of the more mundane or common kinds of concerns that can be maybe tailored more specifically and still maintain some of the intent of the historic ordinance. I do think it's inherently unfair for some properties on the perimeter of the park to be given consideration for removal from the historic district, while others would not be. I know that there are proposals right now for the West End condominium to be removed from the historic district. And then it wraps around Oak Hill, and then suddenly it stops. It stops after the city-owned property. And then it kind of resumes later, and then here we go, we pick it up again over on Evergreen and to include the DDA properties. It seems to me that that's cherry-picking properties, and frankly, I find it somewhat offensive that my properties would be excluded from that, as well as other properties that are on the perimeter of the park. Many of the issues that would justify excluding those properties from the district would apply to all the properties, not just the properties that are owned by the city or that have already been developed. There have been a number of single-family homes that have been already demolished on the perimeter of the park, despite being in the district. That's already occurred. So again, that lends additional substance to the substantive changes that have gone on, particularly on Oak Hill Avenue and on the south side, on the perimeter of the park. I have concerns about losing rights. When I went to school, I learned about your property rights are like a bundle of sticks, and I don't want to lose my bundle of sticks. I've been there for 37 years. I've worked very hard. I've been a contributing member of this community. I respect the concerns of those that are in the district about wanting to maintain the safety and security of their own investments. But I'm not so sure that historic district designations necessarily speak to that end. They may, but my sense is that I would urge the council, as I have done previously, to take a look at Oak Hill Avenue as it relates, as it's affected specifically by what goes on the perimeter of the park and adjoining development. In that light, I would also ask or tell you that I'll be probably submitting something more formal in writing with respect to my views on this subject, but I appreciate your consideration.
Great. Will you take a card with you and fill
Sure.
it out? Thank you. Not one that already's been filled out. Okay, thanks.
I'll make sure I don't take it.
Oh, okay, thank you. Would anybody else like to address council?
Hello, everyone. My name is Connor Meston. I work in the office of the MSU Student Housing Cooperative. I'm also a former president of the MSU Student Housing Cooperative, and I'm reading a statement today on behalf of those who work at the office of the Student Housing Cooperative. I'm here to convey an additional position on the co-op's view on the matter at hand. Today, we urge you to consider the motivation and impact of your decision concerning the boundaries of this historic district, and specifically to ask that 239 Oak Hill Avenue and other neighboring properties lining Valley Court Park be excluded from the historic district. Generally, historic districts are intended to unite properties with shared heritage or significant cultural value. While this often results in maintaining neighborhood character and placemaking, there are other less onerous and paternalistic planning tools to achieve this end. In this case, it appears as though the historic district is being used as an additional overlay, or a buffer, as many have called it, to protect aspects of the neighborhood from blight or decreased property values. The problem with this is that the character of the neighborhood is not unified and has evolved significantly over time already. Designating old buildings to meet certain certificates of historic appropriateness is not the same as placemaking or maintaining the safety, accessibility, and beauty of a neighborhood. At some point, these buildings require additional funds to maintain and renovate. Many homeowners, including the co-op, do not have the same privilege or deep pockets to invest in historic restoration. As East Lansing moves towards form-based zoning, there is an opportunity to define acceptable architectural and aesthetic characteristics with the flexibility to accommodate changes in use and economic ability. We maintain accessible quality housing with active members who engage in democratic citizenship. We strive to have neighbors understand and appreciate cooperative culture and see co-ops houses as an asset in the community. We believe, as others have voiced, that the historic district presupposes economic privileges that tie the hands of an organization committed to maintaining quality, accessible housing. We believe that because designated city properties have been removed from the historic district, private owners should be granted the same opportunity. As cooperative homeowners with a long-term vested interest in this community, we expect a just and equitable resolution that applies the same standards for historic district inclusion to all properties surrounding the park, not just our individual properties, but also others who will be negatively impacted and constrained with the cost of the quality of life for the benefit of the few. We also hope to submit something in writing at a later date, and I hope that this adequately represents all of the rest of the staff of the Student Housing Cooperative who could not be here today. Thank you for your thoughtful consideration.
Thank you. Will you grab a blue card, please,
Yep.
and fill it out?
Thanks for coming, Connor.
Would anybody else like to address council? City manager was it? Oh, no. Okay. Okay, let's move on to agenda item 4.1, plea bargains. And you are our staff person?
Yeah, so I invited the city attorney as well to come and talk about this issue. So this actually started via a conversation between myself and Mr. Yaden regarding what a previous speaker had mentioned, driving on a suspended license. And we went back and forth a little bit, and my concern was really mainly with where there's a financial hardship, right? So if somebody has unpaid tickets, they end up getting another $500 fine. I think the previous speaker outlined it fairly well. And Mr. Yaden and myself, I'm not an attorney, so Mr. Yaden very expertly suggested that we look at our plea bargaining policies rather than making this a formal change to, via an ordinance, right? And so in our conversation, we also talked about the last time that these were actually brought before council. And so rather than just bringing just the driving while license suspended issue up here, we attached the entirety of the plea bargaining policies. Tom was good, has offered to go over kind of an overview of what our policies have been in the past, what the conversation has been in the past along this, but really this is kind of an opportunity for us to review these policies and make sure that they are what the council wants for our community and wants to see out of those who act for us. So
You don't want to just focus on the driving without a license, you want to look at all of these?
So I would like to make some formal changes to those, but I'd also like to ship that over to our judges at some point before it comes back to a formal vote, as well as our police chief, just to make sure that we've got an okay, and then hopefully see this back on a regular meeting agenda in early February. So these have been attached onto our agenda, so if other council members do have other questions on these items, we have our city attorney here, but I'll lead it over to him so he can go over.
And I'll try to be as brief as possible. I want to make sure you understand how the chart works. The plea offer is on the left side, so where we said no offer, we gave examples of cases where we would make no plea bargain offer, and they would have to plead to the charge or go to trial over that charge. So those are the types of offenses we consider the most serious offenses that come through the city of East Lansing, the ones that we would make no offer on. And again, the high BACs above a .22, prior, drunk drivings with prior offenses, those types of things we consider to be serious. The next plea offer is where there's one or more charges and we dismiss a charge or two in order to allow a plea to a charge or two. So that's the next batch of, and that's usually when there's multiple charges on a given defendant for the same offense. so, or the same time of offense. The other is offer to reduce to another misdemeanor charge, what we consider a lesser misdemeanor charge. That would be like reducing a drunk driving to an impaired driving, or some other misdemeanor charge to a lesser misdemeanor charge. You'll note that the driver's while license suspended is one of those, and sometimes we'll reduce those to a no operator's license in possession. And it's important, I think, and I'll discuss that a little bit later, but to know the penalties for each, so to know why $500 might be an appropriate fine or a fee to pay for that under certain circumstances. And certainly there are circumstances that we all agree are probably inappropriate to charge someone $500. Defining those might be a little different, or how you view people in that context might be a little different from a prosecution standpoint as opposed to the standpoint of a defense attorney, but we're here to do what counsel wants on those. So the second category is the plea offer, where we reduce a misdemeanor to a civil infraction. We usually have a 6-month deferral period. It's kind of like a probationary period where they have to stay out of trouble, but they ultimately get a civil infraction. And the deferral period is kind of like a time period where we're saying, okay, we're going to give you a really, what we think is a good deal, a civil infraction. It takes the criminal aspect out of your case. We're going to give you a civil infraction. But you're going to have to stay out of trouble for 6 months. We don't think most people go their whole lives without getting into trouble. We think it's not too much to ask for somebody to stay out of trouble for 6 months. I know we've had backlash on that before, and some people say, well, that's a long time in a college person's life. And it is, but it's also a relatively short time as well for somebody to actually just stay out of trouble. And then the disorderly offenses, where we, again, don't do those, are the more serious ones listed there, then are only sometimes included, and then those that are rarely included. The next set is traffic offenses, and again, that's where we sometimes reduce a DWLS to a suspension with a $500 fine, and that's the one that was being discussed. But I think it's important to note that DWS has evolved over the years. It used to be if you were driving while license suspended, you had a 5-day minimum jail time. That's how serious the Secretary of State took that, and the state legislature took it. There was actually a minimum jail time imposed for that. The Secretary of State looks at DWLS, pretty seriously, because they have these suspensions for a reason. I mean, because people are bad drivers, they suspend their license. They don't want them out driving around because people have problems with alcohol, and that's part of the punishment, is that you lose your driving privileges for a period of time. So the Secretary of State and our office has always looked at that as a relatively serious offense. When we reduce a suspended ops to a civil infraction, in particular, these are non-abstracted civil infractions. So they don't even go on people's driving records. So we don't think a $500 fine for that is onerous. If somebody walks in and were to plead guilty to a driving while license suspended because they had an unpaid ticket somewhere, if they were just to plead guilty and not come to our office for a deal, they'd get at least a few $100 fine, they'd get 2 points on their license, they'd get another 30-day license suspension for driving while they were suspended, and then and the 2 points. So when we reduce it to a civil infraction of what that doesn't even go to the Secretary of State, and charge them $500, we think that that's a fair trade for the good deal that they're getting by not having the Secretary of State ever find out that they were driving while their license was suspended. So while it seems like it's a high price, it isn't. And I think also that the reason that I suggested to Councilmember Stevens that this is better treated as a plea bargain policy than an ordinance change is because of the wide variety of people you get under these circumstances. There are certainly the ones that the public defender portrayed, where people are driving to work and they're driving to get somebody some medication, and in those cases we already do take that kind of stuff into consideration. We think more often the case is people are out just driving around. We think it's unlikely that they got arrested the one time they were out driving around, because that would make them probably the unluckiest person in the world. So we are assuming that they were doing this, ignoring their suspension on a regular basis. You know, there's the people who can't afford to pay the tickets, and then there's the people who don't prioritize paying their tickets when they get them. And so we've always done what the prosecutor's office done. If it's a matter of unpaid tickets, we say, go get your tickets paid, get your license reinstated, you get a better deal. But we don't, certainly $500 under some of those circumstances might be considered high if a person is truly indigent, but that's something that we try to ferret out at the pretrial. So that's something that Mr. Jackson is always free to bring to our attention. If the person was actually driving to work and they can prove that, he can always bring that to our attention, and we always take that into consideration as well. But again, we think we're actually giving a pretty good deal on that already. So, is there a question? Oh.
Yep. Councilmember Bedford. I mean,
I'm done.
Yep.
If anybody has any other questions.
Where do the fines that are assessed by this court go?
Some of them go to the city. There's a breakdown because of the class of city we are. We retain fines. Costs are a different matter. So in each quote fines and costs, there's a breakdown. Some of the costs go to the state. We retain the actual fines because of the type of district court we are.
As we look into this, could you give us a breakdown of, or perhaps the court administrator would be more appropriate, how much money the city and court take in and how much goes to the state?
Yeah, I don't have those figures with me today, but we can certainly get those for you.
And that may be more appropriately addressed to the court administrator, but somehow I'd like to see that.
Yeah, those are all tracked, and we can get those to you.
Thank you.
That's it. Mayor Pro Tem Stevens?
Cool. So I have a couple of, and it's a great point. So one of the reasons why I want this shipped over to the court at some point, as well as our police department, and then brought to a later meeting, is so we can get a perspective from all angles on this. But right now, I mean, I would like to see us, the one change that I would like in our plea bargaining policies is if you're driving while license suspended and you have that 30 days and you do what you need to do, you get your license back. And if it's a financial reason, so let's call it child support, let's call it unpaid tickets, you get that license back within 30 days, I want to see that charge dismissed. Or there to be a significantly less fee on that. I'd be amendable to $100. And then if they can't clear their license, I'd be amendable to a higher fee and, the civil infraction charge. But that's the change that I would like to see. And I think that that's good for us because, I mean, it's good for our citizens because, at the end of the day, if they're driving and their license is suspended because they couldn't afford to pay parking tickets or they couldn't afford to pay speeding tickets, and we're assessing another $500 on them, it's not going to help their situation. And so that's what I'd like to see.
Councilmember Meadows?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly willing to talk about any of this. I do think that this plea bargain policy was developed probably with consideration of the police department, consideration of the court, and any time we have anything in place, it doesn't hurt for us to take a look at it every once in a while. But I want to concentrate on this traffic offense thing because while you've indicated there's a bargain here for the individual who might pay the $500 in the sense that they're not getting points, they're not having their insurance rates go up, assuming they have insurance. I think that we do need to look at that figure and adjust that in some way. And in one sense, everything we heard tonight from Mr. Jackson was, really about consideration of indigency, of the actual ability of the individual to make these payments. And to the extent that you're already doing that, that doesn't show up in this plea bargain policy, and maybe we need to add a little information there with regard to it to the extent that there are other communities that actually consider indigency in establishing a plea bargain policy on these type of violations, then I don't know if they're out there, but maybe you do, and I'd like to see that information and how they arrived at that. As far as the $100 or some other figure, I want to make sure that it's, we get compensated for the time that the city has spent on something like this. So whatever that figure is, seems to me to be an appropriate figure. I don't know if it's 100 or 150 or 250, but some kind of analysis of this actual amount. I'm sure that at the time this was established, you were advising the council that $500 was the right number, but I'd like to see some more information with regard to that.
Certainly.
Councilmember Babcock. Oh, Councilmember Gregg.
We're frequently confused.
Yeah, no. I forgot that you asked to speak. I didn't confuse you two.
Fighting for it. Okay, just a very quick point of clarification, and then of course we'd love to hear what Lisa has to say. A suspended license means there has been some type of action that created the suspension. It's different than an expired license, right?
Correct. It's usually because of an unpaid ticket or a failure to appear for a ticket.
Okay.
Or then there's what we call the unsatisfactory driving record suspensions, where they've accumulated too many points or they've committed a offense that requires a suspension, like drunk driving.
So just to back up Councilmember Stevens' point, that in a fair number of cases, there is some action that could be taken to address the reason for suspension. So that's not an unusual circumstance, it's a very typical circumstance.
It's not uncommon at all
Okay.
that somebody's suspended because they failed to appear in court or failed to comply with a court judgment.
Okay.
Councilmember Babcock.
At one point, it was an unpaid 3 tickets or 6 tickets that got you driving with suspended license. Not that I know all that well. Thank you very much. Let me just say I parked at MSU a lot. Moving on. I would like to have a longer discussion, though, about child support and driver's license, because in my experience, it's not necessarily indigency that drives failing to pay child support, and sadly, that is sometimes the only thing that gets child support paid. So as we proceed, have a longer talk about that. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
That's fine by me, but
Mayor Botel?
That's fine by me, but I would love to get at this public meeting consensus that if it's tickets. So I think that if somebody has unpaid tickets in the past, if they go out, they take care of their tickets, their license is reinstated, that either we significantly lower that fee or we get rid of the fee entirely. So is everybody okay with that?
Well,
Or
let me add just one thing before
Yeah.
I go to you, Councilmember Meadows. I think that the child support would fit in there too, because to get their license back, they would have to pay the child support.
No,
So what
I
you're
know,
saying
I
is
know.
anything that is an outstanding charge to the driver, and that's why the driver doesn't have their license.
Right.
If they go and remedy that, then they come back, you either want a lower fee or no fee.
Right.
Yes, Councilmember Meadows?
Yeah, I'm not willing to commit to that at this point in time. I'll just say from my standpoint, you've indicated that you want the court and the police department to review these policies and provide input back to us. So it would seem to me that we're coming back to another discussion-only meeting with that information, and at that point, we may make a decision as to how we want to go forward with this stuff.
That's fine, but I would just like at least a somewhat consensus that we're open to that conversation, so that way.
I'm open to the conversation.
When the court is looking at this, they're looking at it from the lens that this is something that the council may do. So what is the analysis of that, rather than just reasons behind what the fees are and what our costs are?
Okay, so Councilmember Meadows?
I don't have a problem indicating I'm open to that discussion, but I
Councilmember
think we need
Babcock?
that information. So.
I'm certainly open to the discussion, yes.
Councilmember Gregg?
Fully open.
As am I.
So could we have something written up with regards to our plea bargaining policies that reflected that policy, and then we might be able to ship it over to the police department and the court, and then we could bring it back to the council at a later time?
Sure. And just to clarify Councilmember Babcock's point earlier, the 6 unpaid tickets is parking tickets. So if you had 6 unpaid parking tickets, they would put a hold on your license and not let you renew it. They wouldn't suspend your license for it. But if you get 6, but if you get just 1 unpaid, like traffic ticket, like speeding ticket or something like that, they've always been able to suspend your license for that.
They'll also withhold your diploma, as I recall.
That's actually true.
That happens too. Somebody clearly has, now you know what my problem is, and I guess somebody else has been parking at Michigan State. Ha-ha.
Councilmember Gregg.
So for an unpaid violation ticket, what's the typical period of time that it would take between the issuance of the ticket to where the suspended license? Are we talking about months, years, like?
It depends on if it's a failure to appear in court. That happens pretty quickly. Normally,
Okay.
you have 10 days to appear in court if you get a ticket to address it. If you don't show up, they usually send a notice, a default notice first, and then if you don't pay the default judgment or do something to set aside the default, then you get a notice that your license has been suspended. So that's usually, I think, probably a 2 or 3 week process. I brought Erin Housefield here. She's my chief prosecutor, so it's been a couple 100 years since I did a pretrial, so she's here to update anybody.
But we're not talking about 8 months of an unpaid ticket. We're talking about 2 weeks of an unpaid ticket sometimes.
Sometimes it's a few weeks.
Okay.
And then they can pay that anytime they're out. They can clear that up within a matter of just getting to the court.
And then
to pay
do
it.
those fines escalate as they go unpaid for longer?
The original fine gets, there's a original default charge, and then I think a 20% fee is added on top of that at some process, like 20 days later or something like that, and then it goes into suspension.
I
and
think
default.
just kind of, I think the basis of this discussion seems to be essentially, how expensive it is to be poor, right?
Yeah.
And so when we're talking in a cascade of circumstances that will result in escalated fines, our $500 fine is not the only money in the conversation. It is the cherry on top of a pile of money that is potentially owed
Correct.
and escalating.
Yes.
Okay.
The cherry.
So do you have
Yes,
guidance
the boulder.
on what that policy would look like?
Yeah,
And-
I think if I'm getting from what you want is rather than the DWLS deferred at 6 months at $500, you're talking about deferred for 6 months at $100 under circumstances where indigency is the cause of the suspension.
Sure.
I
Councilmember
want to
Meadows.
make clear, we haven't agreed on
No,
that.
but-
We would just want some advice on
He wanted it written up
what
like
would be
that.
better,
Yeah.
okay?
And we can put a range in there too. I mean, $100 to $500.
No, that's
depending
fine.
on-
The only reason why I wanted to establish that we're open to that is because what I don't want to happen is have us ship these plea bargaining policies over to the court and say, council's considering, this specific charge and not get a information that's pertinent to what that change would actually look like. So, if that fee went down from 500 to 100, what would that actually affect for us?
And I'm a little nervous about you wanting to go to the court with our policies, because generally they don't care what our plea bargain
Okay,
policies
well
are,
then-
except to the extent that they affect them by making, 6-month deferments. They have to track cases, and but the judges remain impartial, and they don't, necessarily get involved in our policies themselves.
Then that is fine. Do
The
not
police-
ship it over to the
The
court.
police are interested in our policies,
Yeah.
obviously.
That is fine by me.
Yes,
Also, just one thing regarding the costs, obviously the city is the funding unit for the
Yeah.
court.
right.
So we can prepare the financial information you're requesting regarding fines and costs. They come back to the funding unit. What does the court cost? We can put that all together for you pretty quickly so
Okay,
you can
thank
see
you.
the full financial picture of what we're
Thank you.
talking about.
And that was more my intent behind getting it to the court administrator, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, all the way to 4.2, the review of downtown zoning districts. And is this? Mr. Haywood. And for those of you who are planning your future evening, we are going to take a break at 8 after this presentation, or after this discussion.
All right. Good. I had a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm glad that's back up and running.
Yes, you should have it, yeah. You have it? Mark, do you have that?
So it's not there.
downtown zoning? What was there? We'll get it.
Parking. No, let's see it.
That's on here as well.
Okay. All right, so tonight I'm going to give you a little bit of overview on the zoning for downtown, kind of what its basis is from, kind of what the nuts and bolts are of some of the districts and what we require, and talk a little bit about parking and its context in downtown, and then the rezoning process for any future changes. So first, let's talk about just some very basic information about how master plans and zoning works and where it comes from. So communities that have zoning must have a master plan. So there has to be a guiding document that kind of helps the community make decisions in zoning and master plans. So they must provide that guidance, and it's a policy document. So the master plan is policy guidelines. The zoning is the actual law for how development is built and implemented. Zoning handles things like height, bulk, density, things like that. And then the two have to be related. So your zoning has to be related to the master plan. It doesn't have to be exactly or perfect, but it does have to have a relationship to the master plan. So that's kind of how we get started with our zoning conversations, and in future changes, we have to kind of keep that framework in mind. So when we looked at downtown, we kind of looked at the entire DDA area. That's the Downtown Development Authority District. But we're really kind of focused our conversation on the downtown west of Collingwood. In that area, the master plan has land use categories. In each category, we'll have a description of the intent of the district or the category, the intended density, the height of buildings, and land uses that we would like to see in the future. So we have essentially two districts. There's a third notation on there. So we have two mixed-use districts that comprise our downtown. We have a park, schools, open space, and vacant designation as well, but that's not an actual category with any teeth. So let's talk about the M4 district. Geography of the M4 district or category is east of, along Grand River. Most of the downtown is along Grand River. It's east of People's Church, west of Collingwood, and all of the East Village area. The intent is really to increase housing options in the downtown and bring commercial, office, and retail to those areas. It's our broadest land use category. It's our most intensive development potential. And as such, we have little minimum land use or minimum lot development characteristics like land coverage and setbacks and things like that. Uses are analogous to the B3 zoning district. So when we talk about M4, we're talking about B3. And we generally would see a wide range of land uses, including, well, the plan for future land uses, we would see a wide range, including light manufacturing, warehouse, wide range of commercial and civic uses, residential, and the like. Building height is generally 4 stories at a minimum, 8 stories at a maximum, with 10 stories or 140 feet with a bonus. M3 is a very similar use of mixes. However, it's more analogous to our B2 zoning district, and the future land uses would be similar but limited to manufacturing, laboratory, health club, hotel, retail, restaurant, service, office, residential. So it's still pretty broad. The M3 and M4 categories and the B2 and B3 zoning districts are fairly similar in their land uses. Building height in this district is a little bit shorter than the M4 at 2 stories at a minimum and 4 stories at a maximum, up to 6 stories with a bonus. So moving on to zoning, we've already covered a little bit about the where this district would come from. So We see currently in our downtown district a range of zoning districts. We see B3, which is our center city commercial, B2, which is our retail sales business. M32 is our city center multiple family districts. We see a little bit of that. C, community facilities, and East Village, which I don't have listed down there because we're a little more focused on downtown. So RM32 is generally focused on residential and a range from single family to multiple family. There are allowances for civic uses such as galleries and museums, and then some limited residential character type recreational and some light commercial. So it really is kind of a hybrid district. It does allow for some commercial uses in some circumstances, but is largely devoted to residential. Generally, we see in this district allowances for up to 6 stories when there are parcels of 3 acres or larger. Otherwise, the height is restricted at 3 stories. Oops. B2, this is our retail sales business. We generally see this on the at major intersection corridors to buffer or pull away a little bit from residential areas. So the uses here, again, are very similar to B3. We've kind of covered the uses. With a special use permit, you can have a little bit broader uses, such as restaurants selling alcohol, recreational uses, service, car wash, multiple family as a sole use, and then also some medical marijuana facilities tailored to business districts. Here we see again up to 6 stories when properties are over 2 acres or in the DDA. Otherwise, it's generally limited to 4 stories. B3, similar rundown here, are a little bit broader uses here. So one of the major differences between B2 and B3 is just density. You can go taller, you can go potentially up to 140 feet, so it obviously allows for a much larger density. There are no setback standards apply in this district, so you kind of pack it into our city center. One thing I do want to talk about here related to our parking conversation is that I think there's been a little bit of maybe a miscue on the parking conversation about how we treat parking in the B3. Generally, parking for private or as a sole use, let me see if I can get this right, parking as an accessory use to a development is generally prohibited. So if you have a mixed-use building, residential, commercial, we generally don't allow parking as an accessory use to those. We try to move those into our municipal parking structures, right, to better serve and be more efficient about land use. However, as a sole use, it is a permitted use, so it can be either a public lot or a private lot. So that's one thing we want to make sure that we talk about here. But we can continue that conversation. I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same thing here. And then in our downtown area, we also have an allowance for additional height above the 140 in the B3. So this is an area bound by Albert Street to the north, Grand River to the south, Bailey to the east, and Abbott to the west. In this district, it could be permissible to build up to 160 feet. It does require the same requirement of 3/4 vote of city council and must demonstrate a significant public benefit. This is the same standard that you would achieve 140 feet in the B3 district. This is just specific to this geographical area, not related to a specific zoning district, but certainly allowed additional height. The benefits would need to be tailored to contribute to a mix of desired land uses or additional heights necessary to make the project financially feasible. It would not require or not have an additional negative impact on adjacent properties. All right, let's expand a little bit on our parking discussion. So generally, the Article 8 of Chapter 50 of our zoning ordinance was just our general parking standards apply to everything in the city. The downtown area is no different when parking is permitted. So that's kind of broken down into several different categories. Generally, parking, there are parking ratios required, so every land use has a required number of parking spaces that you have to provide. It also covers requirements for stacking spaces for drive-throughs, general dimensional requirements of every conceivable fashion, and it also allows off-premise parking. So where a particular property doesn't have the ability, can't have the ability, or can provide it somewhere else, there are provisions or allowances in our B districts and our P districts to provide for off-site parking, but have to be reasonably in proximity. So let's see, moving on to with regard to parking, if you cannot provide the amount of required parking, then the use is generally restricted to what you can provide. So we have come across that from time to time. And mixed uses are permitted in parking, and with a mixed use, you generally are allowed reductions to the required parking, generally because you might have uses that, particularly for they're widely different, like retail and residential, you can have people parking at different times. So that brings a natural reduction, where if you required parking for everybody, it would be overparked. Okay, moving on to if you wanted to change zoning, what's the process for that? And just very briefly, starts with an application. Ordinance is introduced to City Council, referred to the Planning Commission. They hold public hearing and take action, provide a referral to City Council, and City Council then would schedule their public hearing, typically a month later, and then take action as necessary at that time. That whole process takes about 90 days to factor in all of our required notices and mailings. It generally takes 90 days. It can be a little shorter, but depending on schedules, any of our approximate timelines are expandable or contractible depending on the different boards and commission schedules. Oops. And lastly, I mean, we couldn't talk about downtown if we didn't talk briefly about the form-based code effort underway. As mentioned earlier, and we can have this conversation about downtown zoning, but we also have this effort that would really kind of completely change the zoning and the zoning map, right? It would be a completely different process. It would involve it would essentially involve one zoning district with subtle variations from location to location. So we are kind of on the cusp of talking about what we have and what we can do for the time being. But if we do move forward with the form-based code, we will kind of do a complete 180 and be talking about a completely different process. Just in general, though, it focuses on the building form and less so on the land use. It tries to primarily build the public realm in a way that's more vibrant and inviting to our residents and visitors, and build into its review process and rules more predictability, so people who are coming into the process kind of can understand maybe what's at the finish line a little more closely than getting to the finish line and being told something completely different than they expected. So it's trying to help close that gap a little bit. and hopefully to that effect, being more transparent in that sense. So with that, that's kind of an overview of zoning downtown. It's a lot to consider, and I skimmed over a lot, but there's a lot to it, and I would be glad to kind of help you if you have just general questions about how things work and what we can do to improve it.
Yeah, I want to, can you go back to the first map you had up there, the one of the comprehensive plan? Proposals.
I think it was the very first, yeah, right there.
That one?
That one. The property, since we're having this conversation earlier, the property along the south edge of Oak Hill, on the north side of the park there.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about what that proposed zoning is at this point, considering that's sort of the downtown.
So that looks like R3. That's.
That looks like R4 according to your thing.
R4, sorry, yes, okay. R4. So R4 is kind of our, I guess, I don't know, maybe I can find it real quick, but I think it's most, we looked at this actually earlier today, not the specific zone, but R4 in another category. And it's most analogous to our RM8 and R14 zoning districts. So it allows for a little bit more density, but maintains the residential character.
And you had another chart here which showed actually the heights that were permitted
Oh,
in
yeah.
those areas.
Yeah, I can get there.
I think it had R4.
So R4 right there is 4 stories with a bonus, but generally 2.5 stories.
So 2.5 stories maximum, about the size of the apartment buildings that are along Evergreen at this point in time?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to put our earlier conversation in context with that. So that was my only question, actually, going through here. So.
Councilmember Gregg?
The form-based code discussion that we are, along the process of, what is the boundary of that area that they're talking about?
I don't have the map with me, but it jogs around. It actually kind of follows what you see in the dark colors here, this dark orange, and it kind of.
So
it's Grand River focused. Of course, it goes down Michigan to the city's edge on the west, but it incorporates all of the DDA and outward a few blocks.
It's not. I guess for some reason I had it in my head that it was analogous with the DDA district, but
It's larger.
It's larger than that. Okay.
Not a whole lot, but it is larger.
Is that your only question?
Well, I mean, I love zoning. So.
Yeah, the horse is sort of out of the barn in parts of the downtown. I mean, it's hard to form-based code the city center.
Well, I mean, I guess we'll talk more about this if we decide to embark on a zoning change, but I think in my reading of the master plan, one of the aspects of the master plan was having transitional neighborhoods between zoning districts. And so, like where we have on this map, where we have the high density M4 use, and it is directly bumped up against the R4 residential. I'm kind of looking at
In this area
the blocks
here.
directly north of our main downtown. To me, that doesn't seem like a natural transition. It seems to me like there should be something in between those two that accommodates a mix of business and residential. And I don't think that's necessarily completely out of sync with the master plan. It's obviously out of sync with this land use map, but I guess, and part of that is just me learning my zoning districts a little bit more so I can specifically tell you what I'm looking at. But it's always struck me as particularly strange that we have this very long downtown and that we haven't moved back further, and especially along Abbott, MAC areas that have already have the density, already have the commercial nature, that for some reason we're just not growing in those directions. And how can we kind of create some more?
That's a great question, because what I'll do is I'll take you back to both the relationship between M4 and R3. So in both of those, they're very similar, which is a good thing. I'll fast forward to or B3, because that's the zoning district that might kind of end up in that M4 category. And one of the things you see down here in required conditions is quite a range of options for height.
Right.
And so we've always kind of thought of the SUP requirement to get to 8 stories, and then 3/4 vote by council to get to 140 as being kind of a backstop to those transitional areas. That's really when you would want to use that restriction to say, you know, this height next to this existing neighborhood or even the planned neighborhood is getting a little, what they're asking for is maybe a little too much.
You're saying that you're restricting those essentially by vote from within the district as opposed to having the transitional area outside
that's
the
one
district.
That's one approach to it. The other approach goes back to a conversation held earlier tonight. You're getting into a historic district there.
Right.
So there might be some backstop in their review period about being out of context or out of character with the adjacent neighborhood.
Can we just back up to the master plan slide one more time? I don't want to belabor this too, you know, I don't want to bludgeon it, but just with our downtown and the weird elongated shape of our downtown, my vision of the future fear is if we have R4 residential pushed up right against our existing downtown border, and there's been some speculation that as these high-rise student apartment buildings go in, and that might create some vacancy in those neighborhoods. And we know that those neighborhoods are almost 100% rental at this point, and a lot of those houses are owned by the same people. We have a lot of landlords that own contiguous property. And so my fear is that at some point they're going to have multiple vacant houses next to each other, and they're going to decide to build a 4-story tall apartment building, which they're allowed to do in R4 residential, and that's going to landlock our downtown, and it's going to create a situation where there can be no growth north of downtown, and we are permanently going to be locked into this elongated, you know, Grand River corridor downtown. So I don't know. I just want to put my little vision of the universe
something
out
we
there.
can certainly continue to chew on.
Yeah.
Councilmember Meadows?
Yeah, along those lines, you know, when I look at this map and the R4 that's up there, for one thing, it's 2.5 stories as a matter of right. So the council will have more control over, you know, it won't always be 4 stories, I don't think. And you know, what you've brought up is clearly something that should be in consideration of any council, future or now, if we do go in this direction. But I'm more actually concerned about the idea that as we go up to Linden, you know, we're really giving 8 stories as a matter of right in there. And I'm not convinced that that kind of height in there is really what we should be looking at. So I know that the zoning doesn't necessarily have to match the master plan. It just is a guidance for us as we go forward. So it doesn't have to be exactly what has been presented to us here, but I just want to register my own concern about that height in that area. I realize that, you know, that makes sense to me along Albert Street and along Grand River, where I think greater height is certainly doesn't impact necessarily the neighborhoods that are back there.
Yeah,
But if we start rolling 8 stories all the way up to Linden, then we've made a significant impact on the neighborhoods that are around. Even if we're going 2.5 stories to 4 stories, you know, on the blocks after that, I think we need more of a decline in accessible height within that area. So that's my 2 cents on that.
That's a good point. And also, you know, as you make zoning decisions, we often talk about, from a planning and zoning perspective, growth being incremental. So as you approve the next zoning district, it doesn't have to be to what the master plan ultimately. I mean, this is like the end game for, you know, 25, 30 years or whenever. Not the next 5 or 10 years. Or so, you know, growth can be incremental. Your zoning decisions can be maybe less than. And we've seen this before. Somebody comes in and asks for the most they can get. And then maybe after that, after they get the sense that they're not going to get it, they come back and say, well, maybe if we offered a condition that limited this but offered that, there's another approach to that as well, so.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yeah.
Councilmember Gregg?
Interesting point. Can we go back to the M3 mixed use slide? It seems to me like there's a really, M4 as a district is just up there in comparison to all of our other use designations. And so in terms of having kind of a ease of transition from our really high density downtown into the neighborhoods, we're basically looking like 8 stories downtown and then immediately drops to 4 being our next use. Is there,
kind of like M2 ought to be there.
yeah, it seems like there should be something kind of blending those, a 5-story, 6-story. I mean, it's a dramatic jump down, and I hadn't really thought of that before. But
Mayor Pro Tem?
So I guess I'm going to go back to an earlier comment. I'm going to make sure I'm speaking I've had this issue too, where I see our downtown, and we discussed this when you guys were on council about a year ago, and we were talking about significant height within the downtown that I was a little bit apprehensive on, because when we're committing to a Grand River elongated downtown, we're talking about East Village within that DDA district that's spread out. So building up is an interesting conversation for me, because I don't think that's a conversation we have in 5-10 years. I think that's something that we, or maybe not me, but somebody has a conversation of in 25 years. But so when I looked at the the master plan, we're talking about R4 past where M4 is. I mean, are you looking at something where M3 is even in a transitional period above where? So I'm looking at like Albert, where Park Grove MAC is.
okay, sorry, tiny little things. So Albert, Park Grove, MAC. Yeah, essentially. I mean, so this is, and then I'm also trying to kind of remember in my head what is there. Like, the Marriott building's not going to get knocked down. It's there. It's going to be the form that it's going to be. So like some of these are taken up. But yeah, it seems like it would be sort of like kind of split the difference between that R4 district and the M4 district, and have something in there that is of a differing height and then of a mixed use. And I don't know what district that would, I don't know what zoning district that would be analogous to, but.
Be like M2, I think.
M2, okay.
Mayor Pro Tem?
So we're going to have this discussion obviously in the next item, but I want to weed into it just a little bit while we're having this discussion. We're having big picture conversations around what we want our downtown to look like further on. I mean, is that, in your mind, is that a conversation that we have when a project comes up that's suggesting something? Or do we want to be proactive on our zoning decisions to encourage that kind of development? And
Before you ask Mr. Haywood, so that's why this is on.
Yeah, no,
Okay, so, and I wanted to focus a little bit on that. We asked about this because everybody said that we wanted to decide on the zoning for the next project before the project comes in. Okay, and the particular zoning we were talking about is along Evergreen for that whole project. So that's what we're going to talk about when it finally comes to the business agenda. But this was, the idea was to get to understand all the zoning and how it fit with the other areas before we got there. So
Can I just
sure.
speak to Aaron? I think thank you. I think to me, the best like first do this, then do this sequence would be for us to kind of decide how far we're willing to let somebody go in any area.
Yeah.
I think that when you have somebody that has an exciting idea about a new business that they have, and it doesn't necessarily fit into our zoning, and then they have to speculate on the property, they have to invest a certain amount of money into planning in order to create pretty pictures to convince us that they're going to do it, and then they have to count on being able to talk us through changing our zoning or putting in some sort of special use. And that is a lot of steps that are preventing us from having exciting business opportunities move into our town. So I think we should approach it from the other way, where we kind of decide, like, what's the maximum that we would allow in this area? Would we allow 6 stories? Do we want to see, low-rise apartment buildings with office on the bottom? Do we want to see low-rise apartment buildings with a cafe, but definitely no liquor sales? Like, how can we dictate those things in those zones and open up the possibilities for people to come in so that they don't have quite so much investment that they have to put in with an unsure outcome at the other end of it?
Yeah, and
So,
no, and I agree 100%. I mean, I wanted this item on here as well for the same reason. We want to have this discussion about zoning. So I guess I didn't word it correctly. So my conversation is more how far along that route do we want to go, right? Like, I know we want to have this conversation about the Evergreen properties because we know that's going to be a conversation around development. But when we're talking about, Park MAC Grove, like expanding that into the neighborhood. I mean, do we have that conversation? This is more of a question for the council. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion either way, but do we have that conversation now? Do we change that zoning, in the next year or so, thinking that 10 years from now that might be developed, or so that's kind of my gauge, is how far do we take that?
Right, and I think because we know where there is demand for development, and we know what we all seem to be concerned about, which is no interior, no middle ground for the northern part of the development here in the downtown. I think that we need to look at the Evergreen area and the maximum height and what we want over there, and we need to do that soon. And I think within the next year or so, we should start looking at the areas.
Awesome.
But again, as Mr. Haywood said, it doesn't have to be permanent. This is what we think.
No, I understand. I just, this gives and I'm really glad that, by the way, that this is a full downtown conversation rather than just the Evergreen properties, because it does give a better lens of what we want our future use to look like. So when we're talking about the Evergreen properties, it gives us kind of a better lens. So I think, yes, Evergreen properties, absolute priority. We should be deciding that as soon as possible.
Okay, so that's actually the next item.
Yeah.
So we'll wait for that.
Yeah.
But do we have, I guess I'll wait for the next item for that. Mr. Councilmember Meadows.
No, but I agree with everything you said. And I want to say that if we are, I mean, I don't know, I realize we have these as separate items, but why don't we just segue into
let's go.
prioritization? Because I want to indicate from my standpoint that Evergreen properties are not a standalone, that the way this is constructed, these all have a sort of a reliance on each other in terms of the proposed changes that we made. And when I talked about the fact that we seem to have this abrupt change at the top of the M4 into the R4, then that doesn't seem to be right to me. But we need to address that as part of the downtown development. And when we do the Evergreen properties, it seems to me we should be looking at all this. We should be in the process of doing the form-based code for this entire area in the downtown, because that is the more likely area where we're going to see significant development opportunities going forward. And then even along Evergreen, where we're looking at M2, it looks like, which is a 4-story building maximum, I'll just say that because we have this little corner up here of M3, I'm not sure what the thought was as to why the remaining part of Evergreen along the park there would be different. I see that that's a transition into the neighborhood at that point in time. It's just, it goes all the way to the other side of what I think is the city parking lot there. Mm-hmm. Is that what that is? Okay. Yeah, and I'm not sure why we abruptly changed it there, but I think we need to look at all of these things, and my priority would be first to do this map that we're looking at right now.
And I agree with that. Rather than looking at the zoning in the entire city, this is where the development's going to be, and I think this is where we need to focus. So if we were going to do that, George, what would that look like in terms of schedule?
I think that with the form-based code, I think it adds some complexity, and getting that into a shape where it's ready to be launched, I think is a bit ambitious, but I'd like to hear Dave's opinion on that. Do you take an intermediate step and actually go back and change the zoning and do changes now? Or do you wait for the form-based code? And what's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what's in the pipeline, right? If we have something that's, immediate, like we have an RFP going out and we have people who are going to be interested in this property, and if we have to tailor it to fit what we want, then we're going to need to make some quick changes.
You're talking about form-based code? Or
No,
zoning?
I'm talking about traditional zoning, the way we have it.
Right.
So where is the RFP in terms of, when do we get the responses on that?
I think we're getting them now.
We are.
And we talked about this. We knew we were going to be discussing zoning after we issued the RFP, and we didn't want to wait on the RFP. So we knew that this was going to happen. Okay,
The responses are due February 20th.
thank you.
And in our form-based codes, I mean, we're still working on it. Our committee is still going through we have kind of a final draft, but they're going through looking for the things that don't work, the things that seem to be in conflict, and they're just still finding a lot of that stuff to iron out. So, and they're looking at June before they have a final draft to present
Well,
to the community.
that's not that long.
Right.
But once it comes to council, I think that you would envision a further process
So there-
beyond that. I don't
yeah.
think it'd be ready to be adopted at
There'll
that
be a
point.
process of educating, bringing you guys on board, making sure that you fully understand it, that it's fully baked in your mind, and then start reaching out to the public. Is this something that they, and we already kind of have, we've had a few stakeholder meetings, and of course we've been getting input from people all along, but not a draft to really present to them. So that June timeline would be about when we roll it out, start bringing you on board and getting some real meaningful feedback from the community. So that's going to be extended probably to the end of the year.
And I'm a little, is the June deadline, is that not deadline, is the June estimate a reasonable number, or are you just being hopeful?
We're
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
this is the third June
Yeah.
I've heard this.
It's a I mean, we have two things working against us in this sense. It's totally new, right? We are completely replacing our code with a concept that's new and a language that's different.
That's why you're here.
And so that doesn't, I mean, that it's going to take some time to get it right.
Okay.
How the new things, we're already finding that. We got to the point where we're like, wow, this language, we just need to change these terms and things like that. So there's some things that help make that easier to digest.
Okay, so that might be in June. Does it make sense to change all the zoning now if we're going to just have to do it again after?
When you mean all the zoning, we're still looking at the priority area of Evergreen?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's worth having a conversation, yes.
Okay.
In case that keeps kind of going out, I think it's probably worth continuing to talk about that.
So can we get that on an agenda?
We certainly can. We can have a discussion. Do you want to come back to a discussion-only meeting, I would guess, to present from staff about our process,
Yeah.
what we envision?
want to see the things that are being submitted at a discussion-only meeting, right?
Well, I'm not talking about the things that are being submitted. I'm talking about us as a council deciding what is the maximum we want there before we see the things that are submitted.
So, I was just gonna say, I mean, priority would be if the deadline's February 20th, that we wanna have something codified before then.
It would be I mean, if we bring something as a discussion and then produce an ordinance, and then the ordinance would have to go to the planning commission and then come back to council.
90 days once you introduce an ordinance.
This would be a process at the soonest,
That's okay.
if we start now.
I mean,
Yeah, I understand.
If we come to some agreement, it really doesn't matter where it is in the process.
And right now, we got RM32 there, right?
Right.
Zoning, correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, anything else?
Understand.
I just want to, just for the record, it's February 24th is when they're due.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Any more questions for Mr. Haywood? All right, thank you very much. And I think we've taken care of 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3, so we definitely can take a 10-minute break. So it's 8:53. We'll be back at 9:03. Thanks. Okay, we're back. We are moving on to agenda item 4.4-4.4, review of downtown parking. And the staff person? Yes.
Hello. Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I have 212 slides here for you to discuss. Not so much.
my second favorite thing to zone.
Oh, man.
So today I'll just give you a brief background on our parking system, talk about the reconstitution of the parking task force and how they've organized their work. And then I know the council wants to consider the question of the extension of the grace period from 5 minutes to 15 minutes. And then we have some space for additional council input. So this is a rudimentary map of our parking system. You can see we have garages, surface lots, and spaces along the street as well. We have a total of 3,186 parking spaces in the system. They're divided between our gated lots, pay-by-space surface lots. We have 2 metered and permit lots, and we have 97 on-street metered spaces, which include 34 15 to 30-minute loading zones. We can go into that in depth if you'd like. In terms of by the numbers, our peak utilization, we do counts biennially, and that is, we do them all times of day. 64% is our max utilization that occurs between 12:30 and 1:30. So essentially, this indicates that we have a significant supply for customers, and we need to work on our strategies to better utilize and price the highest demand parking areas. Also of note is that our hourly demand has decreased over 20% over the last 10 years or so. And that also factors in sort of the recent changes when we lost Lot 1. So that's a disturbing trend as well. In terms of permits, we have seen increased demand for permits, mainly because of new residential demand and construction activities, so workers that needing a place to park during the duration of a construction project. We do monitor the utilization and trying to strike that balance between maximizing the utilization but avoiding those periods of overfill, which is definitely a pain point for customers. The Parking Task Force was reestablished last week. Their purpose is really to analyze the parking system budget, identify problem areas, and recommend short and long-term solution to budget challenges. We think that is a fairly broad definition that allows them really to chew on a lot of the pertinent issues to the parking operation. They have organized themselves into 3 subcommittees. So finance, marketing, and the master plan update. It should be noted that the master plan, we're currently in a cycle that ends at the end of fiscal year 20, so it is timely for us to be reviewing an update to that. Those committees are going to meet basically monthly, and then the task force will meet quarterly. Their first or next meeting will be in March, which will give them time to make hopefully some good recommendations to the city council in terms of the budget. In terms of the master plan update, I think this is where a lot of the sort of thorny issues of parking will be addressed and studied. And I think in terms of this, some of the things that were mentioned at the parking task force meeting as things they'd like to really dive into is the utilization and needs analysis, especially and including west of Abbott, as we've had a tremendous amount of change in that area of town. Reviewing pricing, making recommendations for new technologies, especially those that allow us to use data to make decisions and to do real-time marketing. So the best example I can think of is dynamic wayfinding. We have examples of that already on the front of some of our garages where you can see how many spaces are available in real time. We'd like to make that even more accessible through signage throughout the city, as well as through data APIs that can be accessed through apps, so folks don't even have to be here yet. They can figure out where the available parking is. Certainly those will take some new technologies, and we are going to want to research those and figure out what works best for our community. We also would like them to review and be able to measure the types of promotional activities that we either experiment with or do on an ongoing basis. to see, what it's costing us really, and ultimately, is it moving the needle in terms of people using our parking, staying longer, et cetera, et cetera. Also, on-street parking policies, they'd like to review those. They'd like to review our accommodations for things like e-scooters and mopeds and other kind of multiple modes of travel, as well as our EV charging accommodations. In terms of the budget subcommittee, they're really going to be looking at, in the short term, all this master planning will come at a cost. How do we budget that? And ultimately, if we decide to recommend changes to parking permit, sales, pricing, quantity, locations, et cetera, that should come with a recommendation in terms of what that does to the budget as well. And then staffing is always a concern, of course, in terms of budgeting. In terms of the council considerations, certainly this request is in front of you to extend the grace period from 5 to 15 minutes. I just want to be very clear that this is the period of time for when you go into the garage and then make your way out immediately. Currently, if you're less than 5 minutes, that is not charged. It's free, and you're able to basically get out of the garage. I think the original onus for that was folks who found themselves in the wrong garage and wanted to leave quickly. They wouldn't be charged for that 30 minutes. There is a request to extend that to 15 minutes so that you'd be able to come in. I think the thought is that now we have Uber Eats and other sort of delivery services that would be able to come in to the garage or lots, get the pickup item for folks, and be able to get out of the garage or lot within 15 minutes. Also, folks like Mr. Pedek had mentioned, quick cup of coffee, that sort of thing. So I think that is the onus behind it, and I think from a staff perspective, we would certainly want to avoid 15 minutes free on every transaction, because that gets to pretty significant budget, significant costs. And so in terms of our thought is that we'd certainly take your feedback today. We would recommend that any changes we would make would come through the budget process, and also give us time to go to the DMB and DDA and see if there's an interest from their perspective in helping to defray some of the costs related to this, which is approximately $70,000. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Mr. Sharrow is here as well.
Got everybody. Before we, I just have could you go back one slide, just a clarifying question? Is cost in quotes for a reason?
Yes, because it's essentially it's not a direct cost.
It's a loss of revenue.
It's
Okay.
a loss of revenue, yes.
Councilmember Meadows.
Just one question. I know you weren't, you said including on one of these slides, but I want to make sure that security in the garages is also an element of their recommendation.
Mayor Pro Tem Stevens?
So, I believe Councilmember Gregg had asked that we have this conversation. We had this conversation briefly at the parking task force. So my view on this, and the reason why I'm in favor of it, is not necessarily just, there's a lot of reasons for this, but you're talking about Uber Eats, you're talking about delivery drivers, you're talking about people that want to come in and grab a cup of coffee. You're also talking about a significant issue that we have on Albert Avenue, which is Ubers and Lyfts actually coming to pick people up. And so, we've kind of had this conversation a few times where, there are loading zones, there are spaces within the downtown that they can park for 15 minutes. But, if you're walking down Albert on, a given Friday in the fall, there's 5 cars backed up, right outside of Harper's because they're Lyfts that are waiting. You can't drive there. You can barely kind of walk and maneuver your way through it. But another kind of nice aspect of this is, given that those shared ride services have a time limit on which you have to actually get into the car, that is less than 15 minutes. It's actually like around 5 minutes. An Uber driver could pull into a lot, set their timer for 5 minutes, and say, "I'm in the lot. Come, find me here," and they would be able to get out within that time, and we wouldn't have congestion on the street, which is a big issue that we have right now. So that's a kind of a separate reason. I also am in favor of this because I think it would help places like Foster Coffee. I think we have a lot of places, like Charlie King's that are sit-down restaurants, but also you have, people that are getting takeout and other things. And I think that, especially with new restaurants coming in and our businesses, like Sundance, for instance, that caters towards their clients where, you might have an order that's special in. And it might be easier for them to order something and then be able to come and pick it up through a lot and, go downstairs and be out. So.
Okay. I had a question about there are meters behind, so this would be on meters and the ramps and the lots, everything. Okay.
Correct.
So there are meters behind Five Guys right now that do have 25 minutes of grace. Is that Five Guys paying for that?
So that is a private lot that is owned by the developer, and they monitor those meters.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Meadows?
What do we have to do to implement the 15-minute grace period? Do you need a change in the ordinance, change in policies? What is the actual activity that we need to do?
I'll defer to Caleb, but I think all you would need to do is make a motion at the next council meeting. We can.
Okay. All right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, we would also need to have time to do a programming change in the system, so that probably 2 to 4 weeks to make sure we get the vendor scheduled to come in and do that change. But our recommendation still stands that we should have the parking task force weigh in on it and implement a change like this that could be a substantial budgetary impact at budget time as of July 1. For example, we could then implement this moving forward. But
I'd
that's,
also
of course, up to council.
ask then that you implement conversations with the DDA and the Downtown Management Board to see if we can get contribution towards defraying the $70,000 expense.
We can certainly add those to the next agendas for those boards.
Councilmember Gregg?
I previously mentioned that I'm delighted to be working on the parking task force with you. I think this is a step in the right direction, but I think I don't want to overstate how the benefit of this. I actually think it's a small step in the right direction. And, I know we're about to come up to budget, and I know money is hard to come by and all of that sort of stuff. I think half an hour would be much more substantially beneficial to the downtown businesses. I think primarily where this will help is really with those pickups, is with the in and out pickups. But there's a fair number of downtown businesses that are not based on quick service. And so I think I saw it when we did the half hour free, is customers start looking at their watches as soon as they leave the lot, and so we don't want to foster a culture downtown where people are trying to leave the businesses as quickly as possible, right? We want to foster a culture downtown where people are delighted to come to the businesses and want to stay as long as they can, right? So I'm absolutely not against this in any way. I think 15 minutes is a great first step, and I hope that we can find a way to measure some of the financial benefit. I think Nick mentioned in his comments earlier that there is, kind of less tangible benefits to these things that can actually be financial benefits. And so hopefully hopefully that will result in a little bump somewhere that we can find and capture. But I think it's, great first step, but not an ultimate solution.
Can I say one more thing? I think we should look at that as we go down the road as well, because it's like Nick says, in Owasso is free parking, but Owasso doesn't have 25,000 people looking for free parking every day in the downtown area. So a half hour is really not going to get you to class and be able to get back without paying the full freight anyway. And I think that we should look, it should be incremental, but I'm not opposed to the idea of a longer period of time as well.
So I'm sort of opposed to incremental because people are confused right now already about parking. It used to be free on Sundays. It used to be.
It's still free on Sundays.
Why was that man yelling at me then?
I don't know.
Well, you are confused about it.
Yeah, people are confused. Okay. So actually, I would like to make one change and leave it for a while rather than two changes, just for that reason. But I think, I don't know if you remember the audit discussion, if you remember all the funds that we looked at, the parking one was the one that was barely making it, if you look
Yeah.
at it. So
It's net
if
even at the
we reduce funding by 100,000 or 120,000 or whatever 30 minutes would be, you have to understand we're gonna be subsidizing parking out of the general fund. And you have to be willing to do that. And we just raised income taxes so that we could fund the pension without taking money out of the general fund. So I don't know, we just have to be really careful with that particular fund.
And we could take a look at, the revenues as they go on. I think that would be one reason why I think incremental is appropriate,
Yeah.
because we'd be able to gauge whether we see any increase in other revenue that might be in the downtown area as a result of this. And certainly increasing from the 20% drop to, getting back to not having a 20% drop in usage as we go forward. And then we could take a look at maybe extending the time, because we're seeing the financial benefit from doing this.
Good point. Mayor Pro Tem? Yes.
So, I will say my comment, we're still gonna have the 15-minute, this is on
Okay.
something different.
All right. Yes.
Just a quick thing, I think we also might need a budget amendment, but I want to look at that to make sure. So if we don't do it as a part of the budget process, the fee schedule, I want to make sure that the grace period is not in the fee schedule, because we may need to make that change as well.
Okay.
So in addition to a resolution, the fee schedule, but I have to look at that.
Okay. So is anybody opposed to this idea?
Absolutely not.
No. Is anybody absolutely not opposed to this idea?
I'm absolutely not.
Okay, thank you.
But I do have a question about the timing then.
Yeah.
You said 4 to 6 weeks to implement, but you want to wait until the parking task force actually makes a recommendation. So we could be around the point in May where we're going to adopt the budget and the new fee schedule anyway, and maybe
Yeah.
we don't have to do anything right now with it.
Right, it'll be about that time. How, does
Great.
that
So
sound
we'll,
good?
so we'll bring it to the parking task force, we'll go to the DMB, DDA, have our recommendation ready in the March timeframe, and then have this as part of our budget conversation.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
And then
Okay.
we had a brief conversation, or point on there for other concerns.
Oh,
yeah.
other parking concerns?
Yeah,
Yes.
so this is something that I want to talk about. We're going to be talking about it during the parking task force, and Tom, I mentioned this to you during that discussion. I want council to, in the next coming months, while the parking task force is having the conversation around permits, as well be in the know of where those rates are going. I would love to see some data from, where the permits are. Are we getting to when we're selling, because you had mentioned that we're selling more lower level permits, how many are we selling? Do we have an estimated number that we're going to be looking at capping that at? I know that the parking task force is going to be looking at pricing, it's going to be looking at locations, but I'd also like just council to be aware of that, because we are seeing an increase in that. Ideas have been thrown around that I'm, very open to, which is, when we're looking at development on the west end, moving those permits further down east, a couple blocks with a decreased rate, right, in some of the lots that aren't maybe hitting a, rate of complete occupancy. And so I want to have that conversation. I know the parking task force will be, but I want council to be aware of it as well.
Sure. So we're doing our initial kind of pass at a recommendation to the task force. And so once we have that document ready for the task force, we can also transmit it to council as well.
It'd be great. Thank you.
Hey, Ruth, can I comment on that?
Sure.
Can you divide that analysis between the mandated permits and the non-mandated permits? Because we have, with a lot of the downtown developments, we have mandated permits, so a number of permits which must be purchased, which support the parking system. And I think those are a little bit different deal than
Yes,
the
I think
others.
typically what we would create is just focus on the non-mandated permits, so talk about the availability of those and the kind of frequency of sale and where we think we can increase and where we might want to do more creative things to change behaviors in terms of where people are parking with those permits.
Yeah, and one other
Parking
thing
as
that I want to mention is, at the DDA, there is significant expression that the RFP project, or the project that's out for an RFP right now, needs to handle its own parking. or there needs to be a parking aspect to it that handles what's going in there. We have an MSU-FCU building that is, on the ballot that might go through that I don't believe right now has indicated that they're interested in proposing parking. Obviously, we haven't received a site plan on that, but that's the general indication that I've been getting. And so, with our West End developing,
Also, People's Church that keeps telling us that they have parking problems.
People's Church is having parking problems. So, I really think we do need to be looking at permit parking as a regular thing, because we are changing the scope of downtown into more of a work environment, a residential environment.
Right.
Which is a good thing, and that's what we want to see, but we want to make sure that, people can do that.
I just so that I remember to talk to you about it at a future time, Caleb, I'd like to, if you have an inkling of how downtown merchants are managing their employees' parking, if they're doing it through permits, or if they're doing it through vouchers, or if they're just having them pay out of pocket, if there's some program that we could institute that was like,
Downtown employee
downtown
parking,
employee permit parking, that might be, because we generally know that those people are going to be using the system at specific hours just because of the hours of the businesses, and it is a business benefit to downtown to have those people parking in our structure. So if there's some way that we could, in addition to pushing the parking validation tickets to merchants, if there was something else that we could, some intermediate program that we could define for employee parking, that might be an incremental type of permit that we could create that would help.
Yeah, businesses do obviously all of the above that you listed, depending on their business model and what works for them. It's important to note that our current parking permits they're discount monthly parking permits, and they're approximately a 75% discount off of the daily rate if you were paying that daily rate. So we do have that in place, and we also have the validations, like you mentioned, that are a 40% discount for downtown businesses. So
And
a couple
this
of good
business,
options.
this business person was financing his own subsidy, which is probably the preferred method for a city that wants to make money. And we're not, I just wanted to add this, we're not anything like Owasso. We've invested millions of dollars into parking, and we might be a city when nobody drives anymore that's defunct because of that. I think we really need to be careful. What are you laughing at? You and your carbon footprint. Councilmember, or Mayor Pro Tem Stevens.
Sorry. So what did you say our capacity was at? It was at 60.
64.
64%.
Utilization is 64% from 12:30. That's the max utilization aside from football games. And
Right.
That's 12:30 to 1:30.
And so the one reason why I want to really bring attention to that number for those in the community when we're talking about this is that, and the reason why I want to have this conversation around permits and maybe moving them a little bit more east, is just because if we're only at 64%, you said this at the task force, what's the typical, max capacity, or where would you say you're at
The target.
the target?
The max capacity
Sorry, the target capacity for a normal city.
for overselling your occupancy is
Yeah.
80 to 90. 80-90%.
Right, so we're still significantly under that within our parking system. So I think there are opportunities for us to accommodate MSU, FCU possibly coming in, another project coming in, if they include, granted, we don't know what those proposals look like. If it's bigger, I'm sure they'll have to include their own parking, but within the system, if we moved permits.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're on to Deer, and who is doing Deer? Oh, City Manager.
So what we have for City Council is a discussion on the issue of potentially placing before our residents the question of whether the city should engage in a deer cull for the purpose of deer management. A deer cull would be lethal measures, for the first time using lethal measures to control the deer population. The lethal measures would be done in partnership likely with the USDA, and would be done with sharpshooters, professional sharpshooters, and would be done through a contract with them, not by the city directly, not by private hunters. So this question basically comes about because we have been managing and discussing the deer issue with council, with residents and staff for about 8 years now. So the person who spoke earlier talked about 2011, 2012. That was really the time that this discussion began in earnest, with people complaining about the damage to property, the concern about deer car interactions, concern about the deer becoming overpopulated in the city and becoming problematic for the city. So we have done lots of non-lethal measures. We've had citizen engagement sessions. We've had surveys. lots of things to sort of manage the deer population, including deer counts, including managing the herd, including feeding bans, lots of steps. But we've never actually gotten to the point of discussing or seriously moving towards a deer cull. So the idea was to lead with our residents and have them be able to advise council on a policy issue of great importance, and then obviously council would be able to give us that direction and we would take that direction. This would not be a mandatory thing if you put it on the ballot. It would be advisory, but of course if you ask the residents, then the expectation is that we would likely follow their recommendation, but it would not be mandatory.
Okay, there were two questions that a member of the public asked that I want to add to the discussion. One, does it tie our hands if it fails?
And that's the answer of it does not. It doesn't,
So we can
whether it
still-
fails or not, council is still free to do what they want, but of
Okay.
course it's an important issue that you're asking your residents, and it
Right.
would be hard to not
Right,
do what they say.
right. And then why, the council discussion, why doesn't the council just take a position was her other question. Why do we have to go to the ballot? So would you like to start, Mayor Pro Tem?
Sure. And first of all, I'd like to give props to the city manager on bringing this forward. I think this is a really good solution to a really difficult issue. I mean, it's not an end game solution, but we're, approaching the issue in what I think is a good way. The mayor and I actually attended the Council of Neighborhood Presidents meeting recently where this conversation came up, and we had asked every single neighborhood representative that was there, does your neighborhood have a strong opinion on this? Obviously that's one person from the neighborhood, so it doesn't represent a full view, but everybody at that meeting, I don't think anybody really expressed an opinion that they wanted to see a call, even in neighborhoods in which deer has become an issue. But I've gotten emails that have said we absolutely need to call the deer, and it's a huge issue, and calls, and people stopped me at Meyer and told me the same thing. We had a not a study, but a survey done that indicated, I believe, minor, yeah, it was like 51-49, but I think it was against culling the deer, if I'm not mistaken.
It doesn't matter, it was 50-50.
It was close, either way.
Our most recent study, actually through Polko, was 133 respondents, was 60-40 in response to using lethal measures.
Okay.
That was the most recent one,
With 133 responses,
it varies, and I think 50-50 is not a bad number to estimate where people would be on this
yeah,
issue.
And maybe I'm remembering a previous one before Polko, but
Yes.
I think this is a good way to go about this because, and for a lot of different issues, but specifically for this one because I don't know what the community wants, and this is a community issue. To sit here and make that decision, and there are good arguments for it, and there are very good arguments against it as well, without knowing what the community wants us to do is an uncomfortable position. I mean, granted, we put ourselves in that position often with issues, but I think if we can do this, it's a good thing to do because then the citizens get to decide and we can go with what their will is.
Anybody else? I think that's, Councilmember Meadows?
I did have a comment, and I'm ready to say let's call the deer, frankly, and but I'm willing to support this because I think that there are at least two members who haven't sat through the one room filled with let's call the deer and one room filled with please do not be shooting deer in the city of East Lansing. I can understand why there's some feeling with regard to it. I think that it has been done in Ann Arbor and in Meridian Township and probably elsewhere in an appropriate way, but I think we need to make sure when we talk about this issue and what would be going on the ballot that really what we're asking is we have to do this. It isn't just 1 year that we're going to be doing this. This is the beginning of a program that is going to go on for a lengthy period of time because we really can't impact this deer herd by just killing 100 deer 1 year. They procreate, and we have to figure out the way that it is going to be done. I think the sharpshooter is the way to proceed because the other ways that have been discussed, including eliminating the ability to have more deer, are extraordinarily expensive. This is the least expensive way for us to proceed, And frankly, if it was put up for a vote for us, I would vote in favor of culling the deer at this point in time and
Councilmember-
establishing the program
Sorry.
going forward. So,
Councilmember Green?
I have no problem with putting it on the ballot. I think it's a relatively elegant solution to a confusing, difficult problem. I just want to point out that we are possibly putting ourselves in the circumstance where it will fail on the ballot, and we might have to then pass one anyway, and that, are we prepared to do that? So
And you'll understand the full joy of
Yes,
being on city
yes,
council.
so-
Councilmember Babcock?
I have to say, I have a long-term dislike for advisory questions on the ballot. I just have a distaste for that. But I vividly recall the day, it was a nice, warm, summer Saturday, and I had a bunch of literature, and I went bopping out to a neighborhood on the north side. And the first question is, what do you think of deer? Well, I don't know. They're kind of the ballet dancers of the nature world. This was not the right answer. And as a gardener, I could appreciate that. I went to the next door. I feed the deer. I'm like, oh, good. So it went on like that for 6 hours. At the time, and those of you in Precinct 6, years ago I was a nature columnist. I was known as Al Yukon. That's a whole nother story. My editor had quite a sense of humor, Al Yukon. At that time, many years ago, the DNR was talking about effectively deer birth control. And so as I was going door to door that day, I was remembering this study. I went back, I looked it up, and there is no feasible way to do it. There is a community on the Hudson River near Albany, New York, where they're taking deer and giving them hysterectomies rather than the more passive feeding, and putting them back into that. It's just not working. It takes years and the cost and the capture of the animals. I'm not sure how I'd vote if we had to vote. I would prefer that we vote, but I understand all the reasons, and I especially understand that for 8 years, people have looked for a solution from the city, and if at least if the city council isn't going to directly give it to them, we will put this on the ballot and let them decide. I did receive an email from a gentleman who's like, that means we have to live with them for an entire summer as well. Like, yes, it does. And I know people don't relish that.
But you will get your wish. If the vote is
Oh,
to
yeah.
cull the deer, we have to vote to cull the deer.
Yeah,
If
and
the
you
vote
know-
is to not cull the deer, we have to vote to cull the deer or not vote.
And as you know,
Okay.
I'm not afraid of much.
Okay, good.
I am. I'm not particularly enthusiastic about having to cast that vote. I support putting it on the ballot, but it would be my preference that we'd vote on it and just do it. And just take the public comment. But here goes. Put it on the
And
ballot.
just so people know my stance, I would never vote to cull the deer. So I think we might have a pretty split council too, so we'll see where that goes. All right.
George has a.
Oh, sorry.
So would you like to put this to
Yes,
the consent
please.
agenda to add to the ballot for August?
Yes.
And then just in terms of timing, it would likely be the winter, if council did elect to go that direction, that you'd actually do a cull next winter, a year from now.
Right.
So.
Is everybody okay with it going on the consent agenda? We don't need to just, okay?
Just
Yep.
leave it the August election.
You have been directed. All right, we move on to 4.6, discussion of the Oakwood Historic District boundary. Is that you again, Tom?
That's me again.
All right.
So thank you. Instead of going through the whole presentation from last month, I thought I would truncate it just to kind of an update as of today. So as you recall, the council reviewed Ordinance 1446 and 1446A in December and directed staff to create an additional 1446B, which removes some additional properties to the south of Oak Hill. And asked us to go to HDC, which we did last Thursday. They deliberated on all of the ordinances and recommend creating a fourth ordinance, 1446C, which would remove only the Evergreen properties in Lot 15, not removing the gateway properties that were recommended by the study committee or any of the other additions as well. So this is currently scheduled for council action next Tuesday. And tonight, we'd appreciate it if you would review the now four options and make a determination as far as next steps. So just to refresh your memory here, this is the existing district. This is 1446A with the yellow, blue, and green being added, and the purple down to the south being removed.
Hang on, don't go quite yet.
Mhm.
This is the first one, okay.
This is the study committee's recommendation.
Let me ask a question before you move on, then. The condos on Hillcrest and along Grand River were suggested to be removed,
By the
correct?
study committee, correct.
And the apartment building that is just on the corner of Hillcrest and Oak Hill.
Correct.
And this property down here is the city parking lot? On the
It's the city parking lot as well as 404 Evergreen, which is not owned by the DDA.
The Hagen
Correct.
apartment building?
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So this was 1446A, which removes all of the Evergreen properties, Valley Court, as well as the Gateway properties on the west there. 1446B, which is what you asked us to return with, does all of that as well as the additional properties to the south of Oak Hill.
And that includes the, where does it stop on the west there?
On the west,
Up by Oak Hill. What's the last property? Is that the co-op?
yes, and
Okay.
it does not include the sorority house, but right to the
Okay.
east of that. And then this is 1446C, which just removes the Evergreen properties, Lot 15
Does that
and
also-
404.
What does that remove on Abbott, that dog leg?
It's the parking lot.
That's the
Parking lot, okay,
Yeah,
thank
that's
you.
parking lot 15. Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
So your options for action on the 21st would be to approve any of the three that we have produced thus far, or direct us to create ordinance 1446C and most likely need to return for adoption. There is a chance that I can have the legal description created in time for the meeting next Tuesday, but I can't, since it's sort of out of our hands, we're relying on a third party, I can't guarantee that we'd be ready, so we'd either be putting it on for next Tuesday or putting a consent agenda on to defer it to your next action meeting on the 11th, or you could direct additional changes that we would need to incorporate and bring back for your consideration at some later time.
Councilmember Meadows.
Yeah, if you can bring up the proposed 1446C again. I was at that meeting, but I had to leave before they actually discussed this. So, what was the rationale for keeping the condos in the historic district? If you know, I know
Yes.
you're not Jake.
Sure.
But
No, they thought that since those condos had been approved by the HTC, they were developed within the district, that they were developed sort of in line with the standards of the district, and they were appropriate to keep in the district, I think would be the gist of it.
And the same would be true of the apartment building that they want to keep in as well?
I think that the letter from Ms. Flores that kind of gives a little bit more color speaks a little bit more to that, where they believe that Valley Court Park and the properties along Oak Hill Avenue are important defining features for the district. So a little bit different of a.
And the treehouse apartments, same thing?
I would have to assume that they had the same logic there as well.
Okay.
Councilmember Gray?
So I was not on council when this study was originally proposed, but it is my perception that it was the reason that we kind of opened up the historic district in the first place was the problem of the Evergreen properties. Was there something else that triggered it, or was it that?
Nope,
I was not on staff at that
Okay.
point. Also.
Yes, it was Evergreen.
Yeah. So with that in mind, essentially, I mean, to me, 1446C is the one that is most representative of that problem. And which is not to say that there are not other problems within historic districts that could be addressed, but I don't necessarily think they should be addressed as part of this specific action, since this action was undertaken to solve the problem of the Evergreen properties. So that's my current leaning.
Councilman, or Mayor Pro Tem?
So I'll make a note that this was presented at the University Student Commission meeting as well. There was no vote taken on it. There was an assertion then that there were members that were speaking in favor of keeping the district as is. And I didn't remember any very strong comments, honestly, for.
There was no vote, right?
There was no vote.
Okay.
I ended up reaching out to all of them again via email and just saying if anybody does have any strong comments. I received one comment that was in favor of keeping the district the way it was, but there was no formal vote on that.
Okay, and so talk to me about the buildings in the park.
Give me your letter again. You think C is what you think?
That's my
Okay.
my inclination. My feeling is if there was nothing specific wrong with the district that triggered the study,
No, there was not.
then we should take the solution that most clearly mirrors the problem that we were trying to solve, which is this one.
I just have a question about the buildings in the park. If they stay in the historic district and we have to take down a building because it's going to cost way too much to fix it, which is the problem in the entire historic district, but that's a different issue. We won't be allowed to do that. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
Okay.
I mean, you just need to go through the HDC's process and get either a notice to proceed or a certificate of appropriateness.
But if they said no,
If they said no, we would need to appeal to the State Historic Preservation Office.
so because one of our
Ultimately.
commissions tells us we can't take down one of our buildings, we have to go to the state and ask them, and if they say no, we keep the building.
That's my understanding, yes.
That's my only problem. I don't need to fix any of the other problems, but that's sort of a problem.
Can you bring up B? You know, because I want to just make some comments on it. The one question I had was, the argument was that we have to keep the park in for one thing, but the park is already protected, as I understand it.
As a park.
It's a park. And so maybe Tom can speak to that for one thing. Not just right at this moment, I want to finish my comment. We have brand-new buildings along that are the condominiums there. The apartment building was built years ago. I mean, it's older, but it's now a condominium. The properties along Evergreen, I completely agree. Let's get them out of there. We're going to be asking to get them out of there anyway. And but the treehouse, I can't see why that would be. I don't see the character of any of those properties I just mentioned as having anything to do with, I don't understand why they were in a historic district originally anyway. There may have been other buildings on those properties before they were redeveloped that would have been appropriate to be in the district. I think there were houses along Hillcrest that were taken out as a result of this development. But there was a Chinese restaurant and some other things along Grand River there that were removed in order to do this construction. There was nothing historic about them. The most historic building along that Grand River is the old bus station, which is the original Big B. So I really don't see why we would keep those in. I don't understand even the theory of it. I don't think it impacts the validity of the remaining part of the historic district, but I'm just perplexed as to why those would be in at all. So I can understand why the northern part or the southern part of Hillcrest, people might want to keep that in, but I just don't understand the rest. And we've had pretty strong statements from the owners of the properties along there that they don't want to be in. So,
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yeah, actually, a question about the treehouse. So was that developed within when it was in the historic district?
That I don't know. I'd have
Okay.
to research that and get back to you.
No, it wasn't. It was there, and then the historic district was put on top of it.
Okay.
So I actually live in the neighborhood north of there, which is very much a historic district. I mean, the houses are old, and they're well-maintained, and they're expensive to maintain, and it's something that you agree to do when you buy a home in a historic district. But I don't think, I understand the Historic Districts Commission's argument that it's not any particular building. You can't say this building is, this building isn't. But you change the whole character of the district if you take buildings out. But I think if you take an area out that is not historic, I mean, the treehouse apartments are not historic. The co-op at this point is just old. The house that Mr. Sadi's talking about is a beautiful house and may well be historic, but there's no way you can keep it up. It just, given the value of that house and how small it is, it's just impossible, given what it's made out of, which is wood, and wood shakes, and more wood that's just going to burn up soon anyway. So, and then the rental next to that is not historic. They are just not, it's not like we're saying one building there isn't historic, we want to take them out. We're saying, I would say that I don't think of those as the same kind of building that we have up in the historic district. So that's my opinion. And I think we often solve problems as we go along, even if they weren't the original problem.
Mm-hmm. I think I certainly hear the co-op's complaints about, or not complaints, point about, you know, being one of the few agencies in town that has low-income rentals and the strain that puts on their maintenance. But I see that as a separate problem that could be addressed through the historic district. Sorry, my mouth is not working tonight. District's guidelines. I think my primary problem with us determining what is a historic structure within a historic district is it opens up this idea that you can opt in and out of these districts. And so if we make the perception, or if we make the designation that one particular homeowner's house is too onerous to maintain under a historic district, then you've got 200 other people that could come forward and say, hey, I also have exactly the same problem that this homeowner has. And, you know, you've created this kind of idea that there's some sort of option about this. And I think, you know, people who purchased property in the historic district understood that it was a historic district, and that was one of the things that they signed on for. And, you know, that might be unfortunate when expensive maintenance things come up, but it is part of the designation of a historic district. So I don't like the idea of chipping away at the borders of it just because people don't want to be in it, because then that border moves north and then you have the same problem going forward.
Right, and those properties did not, that property was owned by the current owner before the historic district was put in. So there was not the question of, if you buy this house, you know you're going to have to be in the historic district. That person already owned that house.
Well,
but I understand your point, and you're right. We would be sending the message that you can change the district, but we can change the district. We're the city council.
Right, we can. I just don't want every person in a historic district coming and telling me that they want to have cheaper windows, and, you know, pointing that we did it for one person.
And I would, well, I mean, we're not going to do it for one. If we did it, we'd do it for the whole area.
But that's functionally only, you know, that's a very
few
number of those residents. So.
And then the other piece is you can't really have this something that's resolved between the homeowner and the historic district commission. The historic district commission is tied by the federal guidelines. I mean, this problem cannot be resolved.
Got it.
So they're either in and they follow the rules, or they're out. Councilmember Babcock, did you have your hand up, or did I miss it? Nope,
I didn't, but I would. So,
okay.
You know, it's something that stuck with me is that, you know, we talk about the problems for the city being in the historic district, and yet, you know, we expect that of others. Actually, the property I was referring to was 601 Abbott, not the dogleg at the bottom, but the dogleg at the top on Abbott. Why is that building not in the historic district? It would actually be Attorney Yaden's office.
Treehouse is not an Abbott. Where's 601?
It's my office. But it's Yaden's office. It's where the diagonal road comes in. Why was that dog legged out? Just curious.
That Fern?
No, it's cut out. It's that first step.
I don't see it.
On the far right.
Top right.
Not in the
Oh, why is it
yeah.
out now?
Mm-hmm.
That's all. That's in the historic. Is that in the historic district right now?
It's out now.
Yeah, it's not in.
Why?
Yeah,
Why wasn't it?
She asked why is
When the people who wanted the historic district went around and decided who they were going to get in, they decided not to put them in.
Right. So
It's the people who live there that made that decision. It wasn't the city.
Okay. It's just.
And who made the recommendation with regard to, we created a historic district commission. Did it make the recommendations as to which areas would be in the historic districts that were created?
Do you know that? We
Too
don't.
long
We
ago.
don't know.
So, that would be 89
1988,
when
yeah,
we did
89.
that. But I would guess that for the same reason that Hannah Community Center was not included, that apartment building was in existence and they figured it wasn't a historic, so.
No, I think
It's an office
She's
building.
talking about McGinty Hinch.
Which?
He's talking about the law office.
Oh, the law.
On the
center.
north, on the south side of Fern.
I
Oh,
can
so
under-
not the apartment building just above it?
No.
Okay.
No. So I can understand that people would look at this and say, people who are not pro-historic district or don't want the historic district to now expand to their homes would say, that's kind of convenient. Hannah's out, city attorney's office is out, now other city properties are out, but we're in. And I can see how people would look askance at that.
So,
That's all.
So then, would you be in favor of having those other people out, or would you be in favor of keeping us in? Because there was, I mean, in this, there was the proposal to include the Hannah Community Center in the historic. I don't think anybody on council was.
No, we're at, I think
I think proposal, the original one might have that in it.
That was the original proposal. So are you then saying you would rather have us?
Well, but we still omit.
city attorney's still out, you're right.
Yeah.
But the city attorney isn't property that we own, so it's not quite
I
the same.
understand, but
We just own the attorney.
yeah. I'm still undecided, but I just think those are questions I've heard from people, and I don't have a good answer
Well,
for
we
them.
can't, your answer is, those lines were drawn in 1989. So you'd have to go talk to those people. There's your answer.
Okay.
So now we need to decide what we want for next week, because next week is next week.
Well, along the lines of what Lisa mentioned, the question is, the three houses that are along the entrance into the parking lot for Hannah
We all
Community Center,
basically-
why,
Really?
those are three rental houses that were excluded.
Right. And
But
they're
those
exact-
are the same vintage houses as every other house that's along there.
And one of them is actually adorable.
I mean,
Yeah.
we actually own those houses now, or own one of those houses that has been torn down, but why would those be excluded then?
Or why wouldn't all of Glencairn or all of Oakwood have gone all the way to Harrison? Those are the same vintage house, and they were left out.
Right. So-
Okay, so given that we've done the history lesson, where do we want to go for the future?
I want to go.
You want to go where? Home?
Person to person.
You don't get to go home.
Is that an option?
Okay, let's look at B and C. I think so we have B, which is the park and the south side of Oak Hill, and then C is just, so I think if I can frame it, those are the two that are in the running.
Well, if we put B on the agenda for next time, a motion could be made to restrict it to those properties.
Okay, so we could at least, if we
And
put,
and it would effectively create a C at that point in time, without having Tom have to hustle out and try to just create something new to present to us.
Is that accurate?
I
Because the resulting ordinance would be limited to the area that is in C.
so why wouldn't we just put B and C on?
Because we'll have to create a new ordinance to add to the agenda.
Oh,
And
I
Tom
see.
just said that might be problematic.
Okay, so if you just put B on and then we can amend it. Would you like to speak?
I think that you're going to want to pass an ordinance that has the legal description describing the district that you want. So I don't know if there's a way to avoid doing the work of creating the new ordinance.
There isn't a way to do that, but we have an existing ordinance, and if we exclude properties that are in that ordinance, the resulting ordinance that will be actually become the ordinance will be limited to the description of the properties that we exclude or eliminate from the historic district. So it's just It just means Gaten will do the work after we take the vote.
So you like the legal description will be done after the ordinance passes?
It would have to be, because it would be limited to that
Yes, I
area.
understand. Is that,
As long as it's clear enough what properties are being eliminated by the new ordinance, we can do that.
Councilmember Gregg? Two questions. Wasn't there a problem with the legal description as it stands? And
Yes,
is
so
that
if-
being fixed as part of this?
Yes.
And is there a compelling reason to do this without creating a C? I mean, do we really need to do it next week? Is there like some reason that we have to do that?
It's on the agenda.
Oh, it's on the agenda
Well,
already.
we could defer it.
Okay.
Well, even I mean,
Yeah,
are we going to get
yeah.
more information between now and then, or you just?
So-
Well, I mean, I think it's just tidier to have, if we are thinking that we're voting between the difference between B and C, I'd rather have a B and a C to vote on rather than try to amend
see.
a B into a C.
So
I feel like there's mistakes can be made when we're like
And have been.
refiguring legal descriptions on the fly, so.
So we can certainly make every effort to have C available, and in the event that we can't get there by next Tuesday, we could just put an action item or a consent item to defer it to February 11th, your next action meeting, where we could certainly be ready by then if we can't be by next Tuesday.
Can you put A up there again?
Yeah, I got YouTube.
Yeah, I would also, I would just as soon have all of these on the agenda next time, with the addition of the C, so that we can choose where we want to go.
Okay, so just, how are we imagining that we're gonna vote on that? Are we just gonna exclude one after the other?
We've done that before.
Okay.
Well, we'll have somebody will make a motion, it'll either pass or
Okay,
won't.
got it,
Yeah.
okay.
Yes, Councilmember Babcock.
This is starting to remind me of being at the eye doctor. A or B, B or C. I can't answer that. I don't see the rush. Why don't we just kick it back? I mean, the agenda is not finalized until 5 p.m. Thursday, and there's no reason to not put this into February.
I agree.
You're so smart.
Take things off the
I
agenda.
think
I'll
we
take
deferred
compliments
it,
when I can
though,
get them.
to the
Yes.
21st, so we have to have something on there to defer it
Okay.
again.
Oh, okay.
But,
Yes.
but we can do that on a consent agenda, right?
We can
Yeah.
do that, yes.
Yep, let's just do it.
Then people know that we aren't really taking
Right.
it up.
Okay, that's what we're going to do.
So we'll try our best to get there for Tuesday.
No,
Okay,
no.
you just
No,
want to put it
just
on
defer
consent,
it.
defer it.
Yes,
give us
take your
okay.
time.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think the reason why there was somewhat of a let's do this is because we have been kicking this can down the road
We're going
for
to kick it one more
a
time.
while.
It's not called kicking the can when we don't have the data. It's
Well,
called
I understand.
waiting for data.
And we've also noticed, so we'll need to update
Yeah.
we'll need to send another update
Good
to
plan.
the folks in the community.
Okay. Thank you. Consideration of appraisal for the Evergreen properties. This you?
This is a straightforward issue and question. On November 19th, at our joint meeting of the City Council and the DDA, we heard requests from council that we actually go out and get an appraisal of the Evergreen properties. In order to make certain that I had heard that direction correctly, we brought it back. We have a price of about $6,000 or $6,000 for that appraisal.
6,000?
6,000.
That's all?
Yes.
Yes, 6,000.
So 6,000 would be for evaluation, as well as a highest and best use
Okay.
analysis.
So the question for council is, do you want us to put that on the consent agenda for next week to do the appraisal of the Evergreen properties for $6,000 and move forward, or do you not want us to do that?
Can we have a presentation on why we wouldn't do that?
No. Everybody forward? Everybody for it? Anybody against it?
I'm against it.
Okay. Oh,
Yes.
shoot. It's going to be a discussion.
Yes.
We have gotten a $5.5 million offer. We have gotten a $3 million offer. I want to base things off of that. I want to see what developers would be willing to give in that situation. I do not want to see an appraisal done.
So the RFPs that we have out,
Councilmember
those
Meadows.
will make an offer
Good
on the
save.
property, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Councilmember Gregg.
So my thought is on this, that we know we're underwater on these properties. And the only thing that the appraisal can prove to us is how deeply underwater we are on them. And that is going to become the negotiating threshold for whatever offer
Yes.
is made. So in that case, this $6,000 to me is good money after bad money And I would like to see, instead, I would like to see the price determined by what people are willing to pay for them.
Absolutely.
Econ
So-
101 is making it to the table. Councilmember Babcock, who asked for the appraisal.
We know that someone else is going to have that information. Why in the name of God would you want to be across a negotiating table from someone who has more information than you have that you could actually have? Here, you know what? How much do you want for this earring?
So how much I'd want for that earring,
I only want it if it's a pair.
and I would only pay about, is it 10 karat gold, 14 karat gold?
You don't know because you haven't had it appraised.
No, I can ask you what it is. I just
You
can't
can,
ask you-
and I could tell you, I don't know. It's important to me. It has heirloom properties. I'll sell this on eBay, but you don't know what it is until you've had it appraised.
Did you say eBay?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll sell it anywhere.
Like chicken
I tend to, I'm sorry, that's where I like to buy estate jewelry, Sundance, anywhere. Anywhere you buy an unknown quantity that says estate jewelry earring,
Okay, it's worth $1 to me. Can I have it?
I still owe 7 on it.
Okay, well, then I guess we don't have a deal.
So
Okay.
Sorry.
So the
If
point
we're done
is,
with
the point is that
negotiating.
the value of that property is what anybody would pay. The
Yes.
reason you appraise a property when you're selling it is so you have an idea of your own
Of
bottom
what to
line,
offer.
and we know our bottom line.
Yep.
And I know part of your campaign, which I think is legitimate, was we go around selling properties without getting them appraised, and that may well be, and you might but now be on another council that does the same thing. And when we have done it in the past, it's because that's the rate that we negotiated with the developer for the development that ended up there. Aside from the eBay deal, which is a whole different thing.
I'm sorry, that's where I
understand.
often find
And you
glittery pieces of vintage
and you managed to get
jewelry.
eBay into
I
that.
did not mean to do that. I apologize. That's where I buy stuff, and I'm kind of guessing
All right,
how much
anyway.
it's worth. But each time, you knew a value. We don't know a value.
Okay, Councilmember Meadows.
Just from my standpoint, this is how we should proceed. If we would decide we're going to have an appraisal, we should make that decision after we have the RFP responses, because we ultimately have to make a decision on whether we're going to accept any of these at that point. If the price is clearly high enough, I don't think we need to go with an appraisal. If we are unsure as to whether we're getting a good deal or a bad deal, then we have the property appraised so that we can see whether we're getting the benefit, a good benefit from these RFPs.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we're going to make a decision. We have to make that decision because even though the DDA owns this property, whatever goes on there, we're going to end up being in the driver's seat on this. And at that point in time, we do want to have that information if we need it. So,
I think if we find ourselves in a situation where we find that that information would be valuable, we can, revisit
Right.
this idea. But from my perspective in this moment, I don't want to spend $6,000 to find out that I own property that's not worth what I paid for it.
Well, apparently, we're going to have a lot of information in
Yeah.
a very short period of time, and that at that point, we could revisit this whole idea.
So from my perspective, I never wanted the appraisal, and I just thought it was a done deal and we were going to get it. But since there aren't 3 votes for it now, unless you have another argument that's going to change our mind, I don't think we'll have it on the consent agenda.
Yet.
I once bought a Tanzanite ring in Tanzania.
Nice.
I almost wore it tonight, but I thought that would be too. And then I did pull off the earring. For, I don't know, $750, I came back, had it appraised at Sundance, thank you, and it was twice as much. So I'm glad I didn't restrict myself to what I paid for it, although I kept it as it was worth twice as much as they sold it to me.
If it had been assessed, he would have charged you twice that much.
If he knew that it was worth twice what he charged you for it, you wouldn't have gotten it for that deal.
It was a store owner in Tanzania.
Anyway.
Selling Tanzanite. I don't know, maybe
So
he was
have
just
you guys
desperate
been
to unload
moved?
it.
No.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much. Number 4.8, so no, George. Review of council policy regarding tax abatements via Public Act 328. This is my favorite topic. Can I be the person that talks on this one?
Sure.
Go ahead, I'm just kidding.
Great. So, Public Act 328 allows for exemptions for new personal property for specific businesses within a qualifying district, which is can be the DDA, brownfield, LDFA. It can also be a specific district that is created by an act of the council. Essentially, any new personal property that's purchased as part of this investment is then exempted for some period of time. The state allows for an unlimited amount of time, but the city policy is pretty clear on 10 years as the maximum. Essentially, the process is the city, if they're not already in a qualifying district, passes a resolution creating the district. There's an application that needs to be submitted, a second resolution by the council approving the specific business for the exemption then occurs, and then it goes to the state, both the Treasury and the Michigan Strategic Fund for approval. In terms of your current policy, really the focus is in 3 areas. Established businesses, so that's $1 million of minimum investment. For each job, there needs to be $100,000 of new investment, and that investment is both in real and personal property. We also focus on high-tech businesses, where the established business would fall under the category above, but startup businesses would have a very low threshold of $5,000, and that is meant to really spur entrepreneurship. I think the original intent of this policy came around the same time that the Technology and Innovation Center was being launched through funds from the Local Development Finance Authority and the DDA. And then the third is also a result of that. It's businesses in that smart zone incubator, which is, we call it the TIC, Technology Innovation Center. Same low investment threshold at $5,000 in personal property. In terms of our city's policies, they go a little farther than the states would allow, and we say that the exemption is on personal property that is purchased within 2 years of the approval of our resolution. And certainly the applicant must be in good standing. There's some other minor requirements as well. Some recent examples. Really, we have 7 active PA 328s currently. Most of them were approved in the 2011, 2012 kind of time frame. The most recent 2 were actually solar projects, and these were eligible because they're manufacturing of energy. The Bircham Solar is our most recent example. It was actually passed in 2016 and then transferred in 2018, but the 10-year plan still exists, so that it ends at the end of 2026. They invested approximately $900,000, and we estimate about $135,000 of abatement during that period. And then we also incentivized the MSU solar project on Hagedorn and, is that Farm?
Yep.
Service?
All over campus.
Yeah. Okay, and that's also a 10-year plan. They invested $24 million, and we expect the total exemption to be about $2.6 million. So I think we're here just to make sure that this policy is still aligned with council's priorities, or if you'd like to suggest any changes to this policy that we would bring back in short order for your consideration.
Councilmember Gray?
I have so many questions about everything tonight. Can you go back one slide? So is the exemption, like the 2.6 million, is that the amount of personal property that is exempted from taxation, or is that our potential revenue from said personal property taxes?
So that is the total amount over the 10 years that would be exempt, that they'd be exempt from having to pay.
Okay. And then back one more slide, please. Why are tech companies so heavily favored in this? Is that from the state, or was that our own priorities?
That was our priority, and again, I think it was during the period of time when we're really trying to spur entrepreneurship, especially technologies coming out of the university. The LDFA was formed, and the Technology and Innovation Center was funded. It is now almost 11 years in the works, and there have been significant companies that have been incubated there, some of which are now occupying space in the downtown.
That was my next question, is did they stay here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Not all of them.
No, certainly not all, but certainly a significant amount have And I think that, you know, based on the LDFA meetings lately, there's a lot of activity that's going on, and I think more kind of incubation of companies expected to come out of the TIC, and certainly we're trying to attract them to downtown East Lansing.
I'd like to see us promoting policies that would promote other types of businesses as well, not just tech companies. I think we've got, certainly in our downtown, we have expressed a desire for a mix of businesses, and so if our policies, promote, we don't have a huge amount of incentives that we can offer to people, but this is possibly one.
That's correct. I just want to, I kind of glossed over this part. There is an eligibility requirement from the state level, and it's really specific to manufacturing, mining, research and development. I think is probably where we have the most kind of, exactly. And then wholesale
not
trade,
a lot of
and then
mining
office.
happening downtown East Lansing.
And then office operations obviously would be another one where, and office can be R&D. So.
Okay.
Councilmember Meadows?
Yeah, I guess if we're going to take a look at this, I would like to see sort of like the entire history of our usage in the city. Because my memory is, anyway, we use this I'm not a big fan of personal property tax exemptions, but I'm not a big fan of personal property tax, period. And but we used the exemption, I think, to help establish at least 1,500 jobs in the northern tier, because we have regional banking headquarters up there, and the banking industry is heavy in personal property use. So computers, all of the value of everything that goes into that business is something that can be impacted by this. And then one last thing, I didn't think that we gave a full personal property tax exemption to the MSU solar.
Yes,
I thought
we
it was a
did.
partial.
No,
I think it was originally queued up as an 80-20, but was a longer period, and which was not in alignment with the council's policy. And so I think the ultimate resolution that was passed was a 10-year, but it was 100%.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I just confused the actual discussion, which was to try to limit it in some way.
So what I would like to look at is, well, first of all, if there's a personal property tax exemption in a DDA district, the taxing unit that's giving up the tax is the DDA. That wouldn't be general, or would that be general?
No, because we don't typically capture personal property
Okay,
tax.
so
That's
that
part of our
personal
TIF
property
policy.
would be general property tax. Okay, so my problem is giving personal property tax exemptions to businesses that aren't paying property taxes too. That was my problem at MSU. They pay us no property taxes. The only thing we can capture from them is property tax. We finally have a chance to get some tax from MSU, and what do? We turn it around and give it all back. So I think that was an error. And the opposite situation are the banks in the northern tier. They are paying boatloads of property tax. And the reason they came here, one of the reasons they came here is because we could give them a personal property tax exemption, but they're our largest property taxpayer. So I have no problem with that. I don't know that we need to change the policy, but I think the council needs to look when we're asked for a personal property tax exemption. Why would we do that every single time? Because for the 7 years that I've been on council, or 27, long time.
27 years?
Yes, every time somebody wants a personal property tax exemption, just say, okay. So I think it's an error.
Echoing that, I've got no problem using incentives where we can, as long as we are receiving the hoped for benefit from it. So I love, if we could, people who have come out of the tech incubator, how many of those people have settled in town? Are they growing in their space that they've moved into? I know that's a huge volume of information to ask for, but any way that we can quantify the benefit that has come from past exemptions would be fantastic.
And the policy is permissive. It's not, we get to vote on every single one of these.
Correct. And I think, there's also some flexibility for council to go beyond the policy.
Right.
It's just a guideline.
Just one quick thing to point out. You mentioned about property tax. Obviously, now the income tax is in play as well.
Right.
So there's income tax and property taxes, which gives extra
That's true.
things to look at and consider.
That's true. Councilmembers, Mayor Pro Tem Stevens?
Yeah, so I'll echo some of the statements made by the mayor as well as Councilmember Gregg. And I definitely would love to see a history of this because I've only been on the council for a couple of years, so I'd like to see a little bit more on it. But, measuring benefit is definitely difficult in certain situations, and we have a lot of different policies that end up saying if there is a benefit to the community, if there's a significant benefit, and we tend to use that verbiage. So with MSU-FCU, we can point to a clear benefit in many, many different respects. But so I would like us to be a little bit more conservative with this. But of course, that's not a formal change.
I'd like to echo the mayor's concerns, but also when I opened my first law firm, I opened it on Kendale, and we were always afraid that the personal property people were going to come in and go after. Frankly, when you do a startup law firm, I had my laptop from law school, right? And all of a sudden, wow, I could be taxed on that just for opening a business in East Lansing.
You were a scofflaw, is what you're telling me?
No, they never showed up, but I would have had it appraised if they had. Just kidding.
I would have sold it on eBay. I would have sold your whole practice on eBay.
You know what? It was not worth a lot.
All right, sorry. It is a discussion meeting.
But,
Okay.
yeah, sorry.
So I think we're good.
But I don't like the preferences like Councilmember Gregg. So you wouldn't have gotten a dime on eBay.
right.
It didn't even exist then, I don't think.
You could have started it, then you would have had some personal property to be taxed.
Whoa,
Yeah.
basta. That means enough. All right.
Yes, Your Honor.
Anything else? Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
I think you are free to go.
Okay.
Thanks for all your good work, too.
Thank you.
Okay, we are now on number 5, Councilmember Communications. We'll start with Councilmember Meadows.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'd just like to indicate that I want to just credit the city for operating so excellently in terms of communicating with people in the community about this storm that was headed in our direction, taking those, it didn't end up being as bad as we thought it was going to be, although George showed me this morning a picture of a tree that fell over on Albert. So obviously we had luckily it didn't damage anything, but there was some result from it. But really I felt like we handled this excellently in terms of not only communicating, but following up with communication after communication to let the public know exactly what we were doing and what the expectation was.
Yes, Mr. Stevens.
So one quick comment, the Crystal Award nominations are now open. A lot of members of our community have been recognized in a really good way for their contributions to the community. That happens on April 16th, I believe the actual awards are. But there's an online nomination form. I really encourage people to participate in that. It's a great program that we have here. The next thing that I'd just like to say, I briefly attended the MLK Commission's art showcase that was happening at 6 o'clock today, so unfortunately I couldn't be there for the entire time. And just incredible work. I say that every single year, but every single year my expectations are matched and exceeded. The theme of a lot of pieces was when silence becomes betrayal. And I thought that was very, very fitting for a number of reasons, but to see what those kids had imagined in so many different ways. Some standing up to bullying, some helping out a friend, some speaking up in class about something that's wrong. It was really, really cool and it's very moving. It's one event that is the first event of many this week. So our actual event, the MLK Luncheon, is happening on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which is next Monday. Looking really forward to that event. I'd just like to thank Elaine Hardy, that entire commission, Randy Talaferro, who's also on our staff, for putting it together. So.
Thank you. Councilmember Babcock.
Thank you. Also happening this weekend, and if you're still watching or you're still here, you're committed. The Women's March is back for the 3rd year, and sure, anybody can go to the Capitol and listen to the governor, the Attorney General, 2 United States senators speak, but it takes real commitment to do that in mid-January. And Mid-Michigan shows that commitment every year. So folks, 2:30 to 4:30 on the grounds of the Capitol. I expect we'll all be there. If I'm lucky, maybe Jesse will make me a hat.
I made 26 of those hats.
Awesome. I didn't get one. On a more serious note, 2 local education communities have lost beloved people who will be remembered this weekend. One is Elizabeth Jamo, who was with the East Lansing Public Schools for many years. She raised her family in East Lansing. Her husband is Judge Jamo. Another is Bart Wojcinki, who was with Hazlitt Schools and was a much-loved man and someone I went to school with from 1st grade through 12th grade. And yeah, and he was always just a great guy. And so our condolences to the Jamo family and also the Wojcinki family. Thank you.
Anything? I've said a lot tonight. I don't need to say anymore.
I just also wanted to commend staff for the storm organization. It was very well done. I also had some communication with the Board of Water and Light, and I think that even though it was horrible and painful to see the trees cut down, I think that we are in a better place to weather a storm, no pun intended, with the city as well as the Board of Water and Light, and I'm just glad the power stayed on. Now, the city manager's report.
Well, thank you for the comments. I'll certainly pass it on to staff. We had public works crews and public safety crews working throughout the day, and staff staying engaged with it throughout the day and through the weekend, so I'll pass that on. Thank you. I also want to remind folks that we have a strategic planning work session, or special meeting actually it's called. This Saturday, we're moving it to 8 o'clock because some folks had to leave a little bit early, so we want to have a little extra time, so we'll start at 8 o'clock, Hannah Center, and it's going over strategic priorities from the last 2 years. Launching our priority-based budgeting for the first time with the public portal, showing that and going over it with council, and then it will be available for the citizens to look at. A lot of great information on that. And then also talking about our future next 2 year strategic priorities with council and getting direction from you on what you'd like to see us working on. So that's all we have. Thank you.
All right, that is the end of the agenda. We are adjourned. I've done it.